Okay, good morning everyone, and welcome today's virtual webinar from the North Yorkshire Safeguarding Children's Partnership. My name's James Parks, I'm the manager of the Safeguarding Children's Partnership, and it's great to see so many people on today's call. As I said a few minutes ago, if you could pop your name and role within the chat, and if you could mute and turn off your camera, that would be really helpful, just to avoid any distractions as we go through this morning. So without further ado, I'll just talk through the agenda for today's session. So we'll be having an introduction and welcome from Danielle Johnson. We'll be then handing over to a couple of our external speakers. We've got Brid and Owen, who will be talking around reflections of research working with men, and Owen will be bringing some examples of the work that he undertakes. We will schedule in a 10-15 minute break in the middle, so you'll have time to stretch your legs and refill your coffee cups. And then the second half of the session will be a reflection of a national report that's been published, looking at what life is like in North Yorkshire, around some stories from dads within services. And then there's an opportunity for us to go into some breakout rooms and have some discussions and feedback to the rest of the group. So I would like to hand over to Danielle, who will introduce today's session. Thank you.
Morning everyone, I'm Danielle Johnson, Senior Head of Safeguarding Partnerships in North Yorkshire Children and Family Service. So firstly, I just want to thank everybody for joining us. It's great to see so many people on the call for this session, which I think is going to be great. So I'm just going to talk for a couple of minutes about how we got here and how we got to this virtual conference, really. So the conversations in North Yorkshire started for a number of reasons. First, we were part of the domestic abuse change programme for researching practice, which was really great, and it was about thinking about how we work around domestic abuse. It was thinking about how we change the conversation, how we work differently. And as part of that work, it really challenged my thinking about the way in which we work with men within our services. It really made me reflect on how we can do things differently, what it was like in North Yorkshire. Sarah, who's going to talk a little bit later, has been leading on work across the authority in relation to parental conflict, thinking about how we work with both parents, thinking about how we work with the whole family. More recently, we've had the messages from the national panel, which James is going to talk about, and we've also had some learning reviews within North Yorkshire, which has really made us think as a partnership that we need to build on this area of work. We need to challenge one another about it, and we need to think differently about how we intervene, how we support, how we think much wider about the wider context for men, and how we can work differently. We've commissioned the Caring Dads programme in one area of our locality. Really super excited about that. I think we'll be able to learn a huge amount from that. And as you know, we've been doing a lot of work around family finding. So we've been working with Kevin Campbell, and in the main thinking about how we build relationships for our children and young people. We know that the more relationships children have, where we can enable fathers and men to be a positive role within the lives of children, families, where we can support them differently, we know that we will have better outcomes for our children across the authority. So with all of them factors, a small group within the partnership came together, and we felt it would be of benefit for us to come together and do this conference today. While I've talked about there's lots of things that we can do and think differently, it's also important to mention, as part of that group, we did see quite a lot of feedback from men that we're currently working with, and really important to say that there was an awful lot of positive feedback within that, in the work that you do, And there was men within that cohort who had experience in all different services. And all the services now, I've seen a real difference, a positive difference in the way that they'd been worked with, communicated with, and I think that we need to keep hold of that. So while this session is a real time for reflection on ourselves about how we work, what we could do differently, how we build on our work, how our agencies work, and what we could do differently. I think it's important to say that there also is a lot to celebrate and learn from what we already do really well. But this area, I do feel quite passionate about it, and I think that we can really make a difference. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Brid, our first speaker.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to come today to talk about working with men and reflections, my reflections on this and some of the research. Hopefully, what I'll be talking about will fit neatly with what Owen is going to talk about. I talk more about the academic research, and Owen then draws on that to talk about in the work he's done. Just to give you a tiny bit of background about me, I'm a professor of social work at the University of Huddersfield and have been involved in this work for a long time as a researcher and have Danielle mentioned the Change Project. I was one of the facilitators of the Change Project, which was an attempt to both think and do differently in relation to domestic abuse. And I'll be talking about that later on. The other area of work that I've been doing with Owen is we've been running workshops for the last 6 months for research and practice with practitioners and managers around working with men. And we've also so we've been engaging with a wide range of practitioners from across the country around the issues. The research and practice tool on working with men is, I've just been involved in updating it based on consultations, and there is also an evidence briefing from Research and Practice, an updated one. The ones that are there are still pretty relevant. They were only done in 2017, but there are updated ones coming out. So I've been feeling immersed in this work for a while. So if we move on to the next slide, one of the things I've learned is that it's really important to kind of dig deep into thinking about why we think this work is important, what it means to us personally, what helps us to have hopeful and helpful conversations with men, but also what stops us. And I suppose I just wanted to share some personal reflections with you about, you know, I'm not sure it's why I came into the work, but it's certainly very much informed why I do this work. When I was 11, my dad died, and it was the single most important thing that happened to me in my childhood, if not in my life, actually, because it was a very sudden death, and death of a parent in childhood is very traumatic usually. And over the years, I've talked a lot to other women who've lost their fathers in childhood or in adolescence. And I just want to tell you about some of the things that's made us really realise in a very profound way. One is there is the loss of that person for you as a child and for your siblings. It was massively important in our case because he was particularly important to my sister, but I had a very nice relationship with him, which was very separate and was all about us talking about politics and Irish history, and I so missed that. But most importantly, and this will be something that comes out of the research, it really impacted my mother and our family. There are all sorts of issues around money worries, around my mother feeling responsible for 2 children, around my mother not having anyone to share her worries about us as we grew up with, about all the stress and anxiety that goes with being a lone parent, as well as the emotional loss of the actual person. And when I talk to other women in that situation, they're very similar. I mean, especially for women who were on their own with their mother, one of the things that they said to me is, I felt so responsible for her. Felt so responsible for her well-being, and I was kind of thrust into this adult role so early. So I suppose I just wanted to share some of that in order for you to think maybe about what might be happening for some of the children on your caseload if the father or the father figure disappears and the mother is struggling with that, and or if he's not around for whatever reason, whether it's often not death these days, but for whatever reason. So I feel very strongly as well that we shouldn't kind of, and I'm really glad that Danielle has noted, because I find this now, that whilst yes, there's a lot we're getting wrong in this work and there's a lot we're not doing, and it is disappointing that we haven't made the kind of progress that I would have hoped we would have made in the last 20 years on this. There is a lot that we're getting right as well now, and there is a really strong growing awareness of the importance of engaging with men and of building that into reflective spaces and cultures. And I know Owen will talk more about that, that as organisations we take time for people to talk about why they do the work, what stops them, what they worry about, if they or their mother have experienced domestic abuse, for example, all the things that get in the way. If they had I had a very good relationship with my dad, but that's not always the case. What are the barriers as well as the supports? So now I'll move on to the research. So I'm going to talk briefly about some of the research on men as men, the role of fathers over time, the role of fathers in children's social care, and finally I'm going to briefly talk about domestic abuse, a case study. I'd be grateful as well, James, if you kind of give me a 5-minute warning just so that I don't ramble on for hours, if that's okay.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you. So if we move on to the next slide, sounds a bit daft to say that naming men as men has been an important endeavour, but quite frankly, history has been written by men. It was often assumed that they spoke for the human race. The generic term men was often used in textbooks. Even when I was studying, it was used to refer to everyone, as if we were all. And women have fought huge battles to be visible, to name their issues as women, and to also name the issues that men bring. So, for example, you'll commonly see now a picture. I often see this on Twitter. I waste far too much time on Twitter, but I'll see a picture of old white men and I'll see a woman saying, I can't tell what's wrong with that picture. And they're pointing out the fact that this group of white men are in charge of an organisation and that there isn't diversity and there isn't inclusivity in that, and that's a problem. And women, particularly women of colour and women from different backgrounds, have pointed to the importance of recognising that organisations, cultures, Parliament, etc., are male dominated, and that stops them being as effective and as inclusive as they should be. Just been reading this great novel called The Dictionary of Lost Words, which points out how language has been shaped by men to reflect men's concerns, and often words that women use to refer to, for example, pregnancy or to menstruation or whatever, were often not seen as important enough or as relevant enough. And so women have been fighting battles to expand the notion of what being a human being is, and to bring their concerns and their knowledge about childcare, about childbirth, about the domestic and wider into the world. Of course, men, as they've studied men, pro-feminist men, and as if they've taken on board women's critiques, have also recognised that it's really important, that this is crucial for today, that we talk about the differences between men. Yes, men rule in Parliament generally. It's changing, but generally it is male dominated in Parliament. It's male dominated in a lot of industry. But men dominate also in prison. They're the majority of the prison population. Many men are sectioned under the Mental Health Act. Black men are particularly criminalised in our society in terms of law and order, and in terms of, for example, during the COVID pandemic, it was young black men who were predominantly criminalised for breaches of lockdown. So there are huge disparities in the situations of men. Yes, there is a model of masculinity, a white, heterosexual, economically successful model of masculinity embodied as the dominant norm. But lots and lots and lots of men, including the men who come to children's social care, do not fit that norm. And actually, there are real problems for many of them because they don't access and they don't feel successful in the terms of our society. Big issue in the dominant norm is that being a successful man is to be heterosexual. So a lot of gay men struggle with not being able to live up to that. And we've just seen this week a lovely example of a gay male footballer naming and speaking about his reality and opening up the conversations that really we need to have. And I thought it was very important that he talked about the issues for his own mental health about not speaking his truth. And there's a lovely story, I don't know if you picked up on it, he plays for Blackpool, that the minute he had told his mum and his wider family and he'd come out to them, he felt such a sense of relief that he went off and scored 4 goals for Blackpool in his next game, that he'd attributed to this incredible sense of well-being. So it's important that we talk about men in the plural, that we talk about masculinities, and that we recognise that within this category, lots of men are subordinated, don't fit up to the dominant ideal. And we will come back to that in terms of what that means for children's social care. Okay, if we move on to the next slide. That's very small writing, I do apologise. Broadly, there is a really good, strong psychological literature. People like Michael Lamb are very important researchers in this area, charting the role that fathers play in children's lives. And he's charted a shift from before the 70s and into the 70s rather, men were really not seen as primary attachment figures for children. The mother was the primary attachment figure. The father's role was to bring home the bread, literally to be the breadwinner and to be a kind of playmate for his kids, but he wasn't seen as important psychologically. And there's been a massive shift in this over time and a massive recognition of the importance of men in children and families' development. You know, we've gone a long way now from the belief in the 70s that if people divorced, admittedly it was rarer, much rarer then, that actually it was good for everyone if there was a clean break and the father went off and had another family and the children got used to a mother and a stepfather, and there were no psychological consequences to the loss of the father. We've gone a long way from that. We now recognise Michael Lamb's handbook of the role of the father in child development recognise that fathers are important in their own right as attachment figures. We also recognise that fathers play many roles in families linked to culture and context. So the breadwinner role is one, but particularly for adolescents, a confidant, kind of like support for children going through particular things is incredibly important. Women are now breadwinners. One thing that comes out of the research, which again is really important for your work, is the importance of the parenting relationship. At the end of the day, it isn't as important that men and women separate. What really matters for it, though, is the degree of conflict and the way in which they manage their parenting roles and their parenting relationship going forward. And the Early Intervention Foundation have done quite a lot actually on the importance of the couple relationship for children's well-being, how well people get on. It doesn't necessarily mean, as I say, that they have to stay together, but it does mean that they do find a way of cooperating for the sake of their children. And so again, you won't be surprised in North Yorkshire, because you're doing quite a lot of this as well, that it's important to think systemically or ecologically about the role of men and the role particularly of fathers, but we can talk about the role of father figures in a bit. That it's important to think about systemically and ecologically and not think about the father is important to the child in some sort of individual dyad. The father is important in the relationship and in the family and plays a whole range of roles, and these shift over time, and the relationship with the mother is really very important, as we'll see when we talk about domestic abuse. So again, if we move on, I've already mentioned that. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. I can move on from that slide. There's very limited up-to-date research on the composition of families, the role of parents, whether they're employed, unemployed, and that's because at a government level, the data that's gathered is about children. So it's the children in need census. So we gather data on the gender of the children we take into care. We gather some data on ethnicity. It's not brilliant. We gather data on disability, but actually we don't gather data on an official level, so that we could get a really good sense of what the income levels of families are, whether the father's in work or not, whether the mother's in work, whether they get universal credit. And it's a real problem, actually. It's a real problem, particularly as we try to develop what's called a more intersectional understanding of the families that come to our door. So what happens to women from who are in mixed race relationships? Why are their children so many in care? We don't really understand why there is a disproportionate number of children from mixed backgrounds in care, for example, compared to low numbers of Bangladeshi kids in care. And there's a lot to be done. There is some secondary analysis that's been done. So, for example, Ross Gill, the Family Rights Group, did a lot of work on this in the 2000s, looking at in the Fathers Matter project. Georgia Philp has done some great work recently on the role of fathers when a child in recurrent care proceedings, when more than one child has been removed. That's what recurrence refers to, and I'm sure you know that already. And her work is really important in giving us a little kind of sense of what's going on in that group. But broadly, we really need to be doing a lot more research. What do we know from the limited research that's done? If we look at the next slide. Well, we know more generally that the children who come to the attention of children's social care, the children who come into care, are the most impoverished in our society. The Child Welfare and Equalities Project has done extensive, rigorous research on that. And so the kind of terrible headline that a child in Blackpool is over 10 times more likely to be in care than a child in Wokingham highlights the role that poverty and deprivation play in children's lives. We know that they're more likely to be unemployed, the parents. Mental health issues are a massive issue, and we're not really again, there's a particular issue for men around mental health issues, because as we know, the dominant model of masculinity is not only about being white, about being employed, about being heterosexual, but it's also about being in control, not being vulnerable, and not admitting fear or anxiety, and being rational and in charge of your emotions. So men don't access services because of shame, and there are a lack of tailored services as well, gender sensitive services, and yet what we're finding is right down the line in relation to things like domestic abuse and child homicide is that the mental health issues are very significant in high harm, high risk behaviours. And so I think it's an issue that, for example, the DRIVE programme around domestic abuse, we'll talk about it in a minute, has been highlighting as something we really need to address. The recurrent care proceedings highlight, as well as other research from Australia, highlight the importance of understanding the role of childhood trauma in men's lives. I mean, we're talking about men. This also happens for women, but we're focusing on men today. The role of childhood trauma, the role of abuse in men's lives. So it's very important that we really start, as we said in the Change Project, that we really start to see the whole person. Now, that we don't just look at the fact that they're doing or not doing certain things in the here and now, that we try and understand what's happened to this man in his life, what's happened in his childhood, how he was parented, what his experience of his father was, in order to understand what's happening for him now. And again, we find tragically lots of those parents, including men who have children removed, have looked after histories themselves. And the research highlights that they suffer grief, loss, trauma as a result of removals, and a sense of kind of what has been called in relation to mothers, disenfranchised grief, where they cannot talk about it. So again, I mean, in terms of poverty, one of the things that I would want you to think about is it's not just an abstract issue, but when Anna Gupta and I did some work on this around men who are being assessed to be carers for their children, we found the lack of housing was a real issue, the lack of stable employment, so they weren't able to necessarily commit to regular contact at predictable times. So assessing them meant really engaging with the practical barriers. Motivation was often there for them to be the carers for their children, and to, as Danielle said, we know the importance of keeping children within their relational context and not removing them or not rupturing those. But some of these men would have been good carers for their children, but practical issues, particularly around housing, but also around the unpredictability of their income and the unpredictability of their employment, were real barriers that had to be helped with. and we've written a bit on that. So again, if we move on, I'm conscious of time. So this is just an article that you can click onto. I assume the slides are being made available. It's an article that just came out in the Guardian last week, and I picked up on it for a number of reasons. It was telling us about some new projects, and it was telling us about the importance of hope in this work. And what it named, which is something that Owen and I have talked about in the past, is that there's often been a kind of, especially when money is tight, a kind of suspicion of giving resources to this area of work, because there's been a belief, well, you know, we should be totally understandably putting the money into women and children. They're the main victims. Incidentally, the evidence isn't as straightforward as that. We have lots of men in same-sex relationships who are victims. We have lots of women. It's a lot more complex than that, and there is different types of abuse as well. Again, we talked a lot about this in the Change Project. For example, situational couple violence is violence between men and women, but it isn't necessarily gendered. It can be both ways, and it can be linked to financial stress and to particular difficulties in families at particular times. Rather than the more worrying one, which is the power and control one. But that's a nice article for you to pick up on some of the debates there have been about. We do know more about what works now, and if we look at the next slide, there are a range of programs been developed over the years, but there is generally a chronic problem at the minute of scarcity, absolutely chronic, and that's a very important message from today that we really, really need to address. And that the message from the research is telling us quite clearly that we need to work with the whole family, that the days of saying to the mother, you need to protect your failing your children, and saying to the man, you need to go, it's highly short term, it's really risky. He just moves on to another family and possibly is more dangerous as a result of the lack of engagement. The programs that have been developed, some of them are very strongly rooted, and again, the article highlights this, in the belief that domestic abuse is rooted in gendered power relationships. It's about men exercising power and control over women and using violence as a means of power and control. And it is undoubtedly an important explanation in many men's behaviours. However, it isn't the whole story, and as I've already said to you, a lot of the men who are coming through our doors have extremely difficult experiences of powerlessness themselves. So a purely power and control approach may actually contribute to alienation and may contribute to them being even more problematic. And so there is a growing recognition of the need to develop more ecologically sensitive approaches to men. So, for example, you've mentioned, Danielle, that you're developing the Caring Dads program in North Yorkshire. That's come from Canada. It wasn't designed specifically as a domestic abuse project. It was designed for fathers to have better non-abusive relationships with children. But of course, the issue around, we know that families are systems. The importance of the family context was really, really important, and it became really important. The whole issue of domestic abuse in relation to partners became a really big issue. So Caring Dads works with abusive behaviour generally. It's a group work programme, and it works with what I've said here. One of the things we do know is that fatherhood is a motivator for change on the part of men, and that we are, I mean, you're going to talk later about invisible men and about the role of health visitors and midwives in engaging men early on. I can't emphasize how important that is in a general sense, that what we find in, and Owen will probably talk about this, is with young men, their partner becoming pregnant can be a massive motivator to change their behavior. It can be really positive impetus in terms of what's called generativity, this idea of how can I contribute to the next generation, which is a human impulse, that we want to leave the world in a better place, that we want our children to be happy and well and fulfilled, and that we have played a full contribution into in that. Very important, particularly for men who don't feel they've got that from their own father. So fatherhood is a massive motivator for change in relation to children, but also in relation to women. And Caring Dads has developed a whole program around that from Canada, been evaluated very well. There is also from this country, but also from the States, a real importance of engaging with the differences between men in terms of race and ethnicity. So you have programs like Strong Fathers. The language is also quite important. If you think about Caring Dads, Strong Fathers, we've also in the past had Strength to Change, strengths-based approaches, not deficit models, things that operate from a belief that people have the ability to change, a position of respect, and an awareness of the importance of countering stigma, the stigma that's attached to abusive behaviour, and an attempt to develop more humane, hopeful ways forward with men. It absolutely is about high challenge. So high challenge, but also high support. And I think that's one of the things that I'd like us to take away from today, that often we have very high challenge and to women with some support in relation to domestic abuse, but often the men are indeed invisible. So they don't get high challenge, but they don't get any support either. Equally, I do feel that high challenge without an acknowledgement of the difficulties they may be bringing to their situation are very important. So, for example, the DRIVE programme has a really strong focus on mental health, but increasingly on trauma. Again, that's been rolled out and is pretty well evaluated. Okay, I think I might be coming to the end. Yes, just it's very important to hear what men themselves say, and they've been saying that they really, really don't like the separation focus of a lot of the research, of a lot of the approaches that they receive, and that they do want to parent safely, that they do want to, and a lot of the men who come back to the courts are coming back with the same woman and are losing more than one children. So there is a stability around the couple relationship that maybe we haven't always acknowledged. And so they argue for the importance of working with them on the relationships. So if we look in the next slide, this is the Growing Futures program in Doncaster, works with what's called, there's been quite a bit of work done on different types of domestic abuse. So the one that tackles into power and control, as I've said, is about intimate terrorism. It's about men who control women through coercive means, psychological means, and through physical violence. And it is usually men, not always, but usually men. However, it isn't the only kind of domestic abuse. I think we've got a bit stuck in thinking it is, and we've got a bit one size fits all in terms of it. However, there are lots of other kinds of domestic abuse, and the most common one, according to some of the research, is situational couple violence. And that's where people are caught up in particular situations that are deeply problematic for themselves and for their children. And the Growing Futures program in Doncaster works with couples who are trying to break those cycles. Another issue that's used a lot in this work and that seems to have some effect is the use of motivational interviewing, because of course it works with resistance and with the whole change process. Okay, I think that might be it.
Yeah, that's the last slide, Brid.
Okay, so I do have quite a lot of references that aren't necessarily on the slides. I'm really happy to make them available, and I hope I haven't talked too long. I got 10:03.
No, that's great. We've got a few minutes, and I don't know, Nat, if there's any questions in the chat for Brid, or if anyone has got any that they'd like to ask.
I mean, Owen will talk about more of the practicalities of working with men. I'm just giving you a quick bird's eye view of the research and where we've come from in relation to that.
Danielle?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment on the bit about, in terms of the terminology around domestic abuse, Brid, around what you're saying. So we've done a piece of work in North Yorkshire looking at our notifications that come through to our service, and it's really interesting that we categorise sort of everything as domestic abuse, and we start from that point that this is domestic abuse. When we've looked at them and done a piece of work to try and understand that, we know 30–40% of that it wouldn't be with domestic abuse as we would see it. So I think there is something really about language in that area, certainly, that we could do a bit of work on, rather than using that for everything. More, well, whether we use it at all, to be honest, and whether we think more about behaviours and think much wider about wider about it. But I think it is a particular issue if that's the point that you're starting from, rather than that work to really understand what's maybe going on within this family or going on within this relationship. It's interesting to think the trajectory that could send you on just from that initial point, really.
Yeah, and as you know, we did a case file audit in the Change project, and we found that was a common theme, that it's DV, it's not even called domestic abuse a lot of the time, or there's DV in this family. And then if the police notifications are serious enough, there is a multi-agency meeting to look at what do we know about this family. And what, I don't know if you remember, but Kate Morris talked about the wrong conversations with the wrong people in the wrong places, and that actually what we needed to be doing was having conversations with the family rather than necessarily with the agent, going straight from jargon into our processes, and that it's very professionalized and top down, and that we know what's going on. No, you're absolutely right, and that's the work. And Alicia Lee at Doncaster would say it's scary work. It was scary starting working with couples, and scary, are we putting women at risk? And so this is work where you need very strong organisational context and very strong cultures to support practitioners to do this work.
Thanks, Danielle. Sam, we've got a question. Please, if anyone does have any other questions, please raise your hand or put the comment into the chat and we'll come to you. Over to you, sir.
I was just going to say that was really interesting, Brid. Thank you. And the references would be gratefully received, because we can search some of these resources for the staff and get them out. Just a comment, really, I think it's really opportune. We're looking at dissecting what traditionally domestic abuse has been described as, because I think it's totally not a one-fits-all situation. And I think in terms of us doing that well, it is also about us acknowledging some of our own social graces around that, because I think, there's a spectrum of behaviours that perhaps people can recognise within their own relationships, as well as with those relationships that they're working with as a practitioner. And so the ability to have some of those reflective conversations is really important in dealing with what is quite challenging work. So I just think that's really helpful, and we obviously want to look at developing what our responses are and having different responses for different scenarios, and unpicking what is conflict, what is situational, what is serious, coercion, and all those things. So thanks very much. I think the intersectionality as well really helps.
Well, as you know, Sam, you were part of the Change project. North Yorkshire was part of the Change project, and we are launching a communities of practice from the Change project, because it's linked to some further research we're going to do. So those conversations will be continuing.
Yeah, brilliant. We'll be in the queue.
No, you are. You're part of the gang.
Great, that's great. Thanks very much, Brid. I don't know if you've got any closing remarks from your session before we hand over to Owen.
Yeah, just in terms of the references that we do, you are a member of RIP, and it's not completely up to date, but at the minute the practice tool is still very pertinent, and Owen will be talking about that. And some of the references around the research on fathers and men is in the current evidence briefing. The new stuff will be coming out later this year. I will send a load of references as well. I'll send them to you, Sam, is it, or James?
Yes, please, and then I can get them on our staff resource hub. But okay. Obviously, I'll give you the £10 later about promoting people's use of research in practice, because we do bang on about that a lot. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Brid. And so now we'll hand over to Owen, who's going to take us through the next session. I'll just get your slides up.
Thanks. Good morning, all. Thanks so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be involved with delivering on a session like this, where the beginnings, or actually not the beginnings, you're actually quite far along the road. These kind of activities are the beginnings of the change of culture within a local authority or within an organisation, which is really important, because a bit about myself to precede the presentation, a bit like Brid said, my name's Owen Thomas. I'm the head of operations for a charity called Future Men, and I got into this work. I've been at this charity. We were previously actually interestingly called Working with Men. That used to be the name of our charity. It's really interesting and pertinent because people used to say to me, oh, you're Owen from Working for Men. And just as a start, it was a real important distinction. That one word in the middle between working and men was really important because it kind of underpins the approach that we want to model, we wanted to take with men, that we were working with them. We weren't working for them. We weren't doing to them. We were working with them. And I think that attracted me to the organisation, as well as it reflecting my professional and life experiences to that point. I'm now a father of 3 girls. At the time, I was a father of 1. I became a dad fairly young myself. And when I joined the charity, it was as a young father's worker, working particularly around the teenage pregnancy agenda that some of you who have been working in this field for a while will remember. In Britain, we've got the highest, we've kind of consistently had one of the highest, if not the highest, teenage pregnancy rates across Western Europe for a developed nation. And there's a unique position there within our kind of culture why that brought about. But at the same time, we've got a unique, and we've always had a unique way of, whilst half of us really want to support parents and make a difference, there is, maybe in the mainstream press as well, a narrative around kind of always doing people down and pointing out, as Brid was referring to, their deficits rather than their strengths. And so I came into this work really wanting to kind of replicate my experiences of fatherhood being a transformative moment and experience for me, and a real focusing moment in my life when at the age of 18 I found out I was going to be a dad. I was able to, luckily with all the inputs from my parents to that point and all of my other surroundings, able to make the most of that situation and grasp opportunities that were in front of me and avoid other pathways that were laid out in front of me at that time. And so I wanted, after a few years of youth and community work and other forms of exploring who I was, the opportunity to do this work specifically and mesh my lived experience with some of my professional experiences was really important. And I thank Brid for her presentation. It's always really great to follow her, not because she makes it so easy. In some ways for you to understand the research context, and really does a great job at summarizing everything into a really crystalline point in a really succinct way. What I'm going to do is try and talk about our experiences of service delivery and mine, particularly ours as an organisation over the last 15 to 20 years of working with dads. And we've literally I've personally worked with hundreds, if not thousands, and the organisation's definitely worked with thousands of men. We're a London-based charity, but we do work nationally in terms of research and consultation. So if I could move into my first slide. As Future Men, our vision is a better future for every boy, every man and everyone. So we are a term that Brid used there, pro-feminist. We really do this work not just for the betterment of men and boys themselves, but because we believe that society, like family, is a system, and leaving men and boys out of that conversation and out of that process kind of makes us all weaker and makes the process towards equality take even longer. What we really want to do, our mission, is to inspire boys and men to become dynamic future men by giving them confidence to discover what it means to be a man. And again, reflecting what Brid said earlier on, we really are interested in looking into the lives of the boys and men we work with to understand why it is they've got to the point where they're engaging with a service like ours, why they would want to work with someone like us. So we do that work around kind of key transitional moments in their lives. So whether that be kind of like the transition from primary to secondary school, the transition finishing secondary school, or when you leave for any other kind of reason. And the big one for us is the kind of transition into fatherhood, into parenthood, as it is for women as well. That transition is the biggest one that can often happen to you, and depending on the inputs you have at that time, depending on the support that you receive, depending on the messages you get around parenting and around how that will affect you and what your role should be there, it's very easy for that process to be knocked off schedule and to not go the way you'd ideally want it to go. So as we move into the next slide, if that's possible, thanks, I will try and highlight some of that. We underpin our work by looking at the masculinities of boys and men, and we underpin those with 7 characteristics that are not exclusively male characteristics, as many of you will be looking at these and thinking to yourselves right now, but they are ones that through our work we identified as issues that we find ourselves covering time and time again in a myriad different ways with all of the boys and men we work with. So as you will see there, resilience is really, really important and key for the work we do. I don't talk about resilience in the respect that I was really nervous when we were working through all these various characteristics that we finally settled on. And I always have a kind of a counterbalance for these points. And resilience, often to me, particularly with the boys and men we work with, and I should mention that most of those are from marginalised backgrounds and communities, are often told that, you know, funders like us to do pieces of work around resilience, build up people's resilience. You know, I'm sure those of you who work with women and families often hear that as well. We've got to build up people's resilience. And I want to just be careful that that doesn't mean that you just learn to put up with crappy life circumstances and life experiences. You know, we hear a lot about people from working class backgrounds or poorer backgrounds being told they need to be resilient, they need to be resilient. Of course they do, we all do, but we also need to know how to challenge and make changes positively in our lives. So we encapsulate that as you being able to recover when things go wrong for you in your life. And for men and boys particularly, that's a really important message, because we find ourselves working with men who have had multiple traumatic experiences, and they get to a point where one that they've seen, or some trauma they've seen, whether it be a family member being lost, whether it be a friend being harmed, whether it be being the victim of crime or male violence or violence more broadly themselves, can then lead to a downward spiral where they just kind of go, you know what, what's the point anymore? You know, often for the men we work with, the fathers, that point can come when relationships with their children or with their ex-partners become strained, or when they lose contact with their kids, and they often become hopeless. And behaviours then, as Brid's kind of spoke about, can spiral off. You know, men can be excluded from one family unit because of their own behaviours, and can then kind of go and take that into a second and a third and a fourth relationship where children are born of, and we really want to kind of break those cycles. Inclusiveness is another really important one for us, you know, along with a lot of some of the harmful traditional masculinity tropes that we see men adopted and kind of running within their lives. Othering people, not being inclusive, is one of the main kind of protective models that men use. You know, only focusing on your immediate group, your social group, in your racial group, in your cultural or religious background can be something men do to protect themselves, to armor themselves up for their journey through the tough and competitive world of being a man. So inclusiveness, if you can start to have those discussions with men about how they can see commonalities with other groups of men and with women and other people from other places in the world, is really important. Reflectiveness, resourcefulness, you know, being able to make the best of what you have, but again, without accepting that this is my lot in life and it will never get any better. You know, being realistic about what you can achieve. You know, working here in London, we're in an increasingly commercial and material society, you know, and the cost of living crisis that we're all going through at the moment is bringing that much more into focus. And this kind of model of being a breadwinner, as Brid talked about, being a provider, still is really pertinent, even with young dads that I'm coming across now at 16 and 17. I meet them when they're expecting, and I ask them, and the staff that I manage work with them, I ask them, you know, what's your main concern or what's your main hope around becoming a dad? And they go, just that I can get enough money to be able to provide the things that my children need, or that my child's going to need. I've been told, you know, her mum said to me that if I haven't got enough money to provide this or that, I'm not really going to be welcome, etc., etc. So those tropes still kind of pervade. So kind of understanding how, you know, that living in Britain today, however tough life is, what your kids need from you more than anything else is your attention, time, love and support and input as a father is the most important thing. And we would think that's obvious. All men hear that messaging, but they don't. You know, I can tell you from bitter experience with a lot of men, even with men we work with who aren't from those such marginalised groups. We run a Future Dads and an antenatal course, which is our most universal piece of work. It's been online during the pandemic. Before that, we were delivering in local hospitals, and we get, you know, men from a broad range of society. Anyone who's expecting a baby in very mixed communities in London, where people are living cheek by jowl across the economic spectrum. And all of those men who turn up at those meetings and at those sessions talk about kind of like, you know, what do I need to be for my child? How should I be? Do I need to be a disciplinarian? Should I just be playing this supportive role? All of these questions men want to talk about, but don't have the social dynamics created within our communities where it's easy to do that often, you know. Curiosity is another one. Compassion and empathy are really big ones, slightly different, very similar and linked, but really big ones, because for some men, again, they haven't been given the opportunities to allow those emotional sides of their personality to come out. You know, you're often told as a young man growing up, don't show too much compassion, don't be too empathetic to other people's experiences, because it's a sign of weakness, as you've all heard already, you know. And to be a father, particularly to daughters, and a lot of research shows that men who have female children, they all talk about the empathy and the new understanding or insight into the world of women that it gives them, you know, looking at, you know, that little bit of you that is different from you, that is inhabiting the world of being a woman, and you think, gosh, this is the world she's going to have to go in, that maybe I haven't necessarily been that sympathetic or empathetic towards up to this point in my life. It's a real opportunity and a moment and a catalyst to change. That doesn't mean to say that fathers who have sons shouldn't go through those discussions as well, but it is a more natural progression because men, that question is posed to men immediately themselves. And finally, non-violence is one of the characteristics that has a thread through all of our work. Our work isn't just with fathers. We work with men and boys, as I said, in schools, in the community. We run youth hubs. We do outreach and engagement. We work around serious youth violence, knife crime, all of those things there. And there is massive overlap across all of these areas, and these characteristics are useful across all of our work. So basically, thinking about masculinity, thinking about the entirety of a man and what made them who they are is going to improve your engagement with them and hopefully create a stronger bond with the men, because it shows that you care about who they are and what's happening for them. That will allow you to do the tough work you may need to do with them if they're turning up in your services, early help, social care, etc. If I could go into the next slide, please. So just a question for you. I don't require a response. You can write things in the chat if you want to, but when you hear the word father, what thoughts immediately come to mind? Now, it's a question we pose in the training that Brid and I have been delivering over the years, and we often have a discussion off the back of it. But I would expect from an audience like yours who have come to a day like this, which is about including fathers more and improving your practice and reflecting on what you do with fathers, you would have some quite insightful and thoughtful things to say. But also, as some other speakers have said honestly earlier on, even if you just hold this to yourself, dependent on your experiences with your own father or with men in this world, or as a professional having to support and work with children and women who have unfortunately been subjected to some, you know, terrible behavior by a man or by a father, you know, it can become difficult to find space to look for the light in a person. You know, it's really tough sometimes to do that, especially if you're looking at your own personal experiences as well. You know, I worked with a really inspirational leader within a local authority. I should say, as a charity, we often work independently, but it doesn't work best that way, working in silos. We really have to kind of embed ourselves within the statutory services in the areas that we're working. And I worked in a couple of boroughs with a guy called Dr. Gavin Swan, who wrote his master's theory around engaging men and did a big audit within his local authorities about his social workers' motivation for why they did the work. And many of you will know this, that you know, they often come to this work because they'd seen, witnessed or suffered some trauma themselves and wanted to actually directly help and make a difference to change things for the better. And really interestingly, I find that mirrored in the boys and men that we work with who are fathers. You know, we have a traffic light RAG system with the dads we work with, and even the guys who are buried in the red have got so much complex things going on in their lives that it can be really difficult to kind of see a light out of it. In their moments of clarity, they see the value in the work, and they're grateful that someone's taking an interest in their care in their lives, and they want, at the very least, people to not make the same mistakes that they've been making, if they've got that ability to reflect. Some of them, they're only momentary moments of reflection, I'll be honest with you, and then it's another 3 months of trudging through the trenches of trying to get them to kind of stop some of their negative and risk-taking behaviours. But it's those little kind of glimmers of hope and insight that make the work that I do, and hopefully the work that you're planning to do and are already doing, so worthwhile, because of the outcomes that it makes for them as individual men, but also their children and their families and wider society. So when you think about men, I'm seeing some brilliant comments flipping up in my messages. I'm not really reading them properly, but as I expected from a group like yours, you're saying some really supportive and kind of inclusive and egalitarian statements there about fatherhood. And I think having that mindset when you approach this work with fathers, being able to still find that chink of light when you're working with a dad who's maybe coming out of a custodial sentence or is struggling with his own substance misuse, and you think, I can't really see a light at the end of the tunnel. The point is that in 6 months or in a year or in 2 years, his children are still going to be wondering where he is and what he's doing, and still be mourning the loss of him if he's separated from their family. So it's really important we just kind of think about this in its broadest context. Right, if I move on to the next slide. So what we do, and the next slide, I'll give a few examples of kind of the work we do. I've kind of touched on some of it as well. We work with particularly marginalised fathers from particular groups, younger dads, as I said, dads from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. When you're working with young dads in teenage pregnancy, we know there's a overrepresentation from young men who come from looked after backgrounds, who have been known to social care services and other statutory services themselves as children. And there's an interesting point here, because I find, again, you know, generally when we work with boys and young men are cute until they get to about year 6 or year 7 and start to get a bit more gravelly and a bit more grindy, and then they start putting their hoods up and becoming a bit more surly. And all of a sudden, within society, we go, oh, I don't want to work past that bunch of 13-year-olds, whereas I walk past a bunch of 9-year-olds and say, how you doing, boys? That starts to happen, and we start to kind of put our own expectations of society on groups of men, particularly those from certain backgrounds or living on certain estates. I'm sure you will have those areas in your where you guys are living, or from certain racial or religious backgrounds, where we start to kind of stereotype a little bit, even if we don't want to. We can't help it. It's part of the way the human brain works. You have to fight against that every day doing this work, you know. And these guys tend to have multiple points of kind of overlapping, that intersecting, unfortunately, poorer outcomes, which leads to them generally, through their patterns of engagement and because of a fear of services, because they've often had some sort of draconian role in their lives to this point, either kind of telling them that what they're doing is wrong, maybe the police, maybe being expelled from school, maybe being failed within your own family unit, and people telling you, you know, your behaviour is causing stress to this family because now we've got all these other professionals involved in my life. They're very anti-engaging services often, you know. But if we want to kind of reduce these intergenerational, and that's what they are often, intergenerational inequalities that get passed down, you know, we know from the Troubled Families agenda that was put out, and from the basis from Frank Field's work around early help, that we need to kind of break these cycles that have kind of begun to develop. And there are opportunities, as Brid said, when men are becoming fathers, to get in and do some really reflective work with them. You know, as Brid said, a lot of the guys who have been through care or have experienced trauma in their life, we see, unfortunately, when we build relationships, that that's the case for a lot of men. I mean, a minority, thankfully, have suffered sexual abuse, and we'll talk about that when a relationship is formed, something that men find really difficult to go into and talk about as well. But I suppose based on the quality of the relationships and the ongoing longevity of the relationships we have with our service user groups, even when we've taken them out of the immediacy of case holding, they come back and want to have a relationship with us and want to kind of come to catch up groups and activities that we might run that are more kind of practical rather than the intense. And they open up and they share their experiences, and it's really important that they do that, because it's a great model for guys who come after them who haven't seen that before. That peer-on-peer support is something that's hard to develop and quite labour intensive, but if it's done safely and you've put the right safeguards in place, can be really, really valuable for a service and for a geographical area as well, to change the culture around men and fathers. And again, as I said, we do all of this work because we want to break these negative cycles. If I can move on to the next slide, please. What we practically do is prepare and support men and young men, particularly for fatherhood, by developing direct, practical parenting skills and techniques, which is really important. We do a lot of that at our antenatal course, as I said, which is a one-day men-only course. It's really important, but we also do it through one-to-one, because a lot of men are really anti-group. You know, there is something around the socialization of men. And one of my first managers, the founder of the charity, Trevor Lloyd, did say to me, Owen, look, you're really sociable and chatty and comfortable in all kinds of different spaces. But if I said to you, go along to one of the groups you're trying to promote with your child on a Saturday, would you go? And I had to reflect for a moment and honestly say, well, probably not, because I'm active and I've got a lot of stuff to do on the weekend. My social calendar's filled. I've got enough friends already as it is. I don't need to go and meet a bunch of strangers to talk about being a dad. And I had to go, God, if I think like that, how am I expecting any of these other guys who maybe aren't as sociable or free and open as me to turn up as well? So it really kind of reinvigorated me to think, God, I need to, what is in it for me is how I have to think as a dad when I run any service or ask any man to talk to me or engage me. Why should he? You know, now what is in it for him might be positive engagement with your children ongoing. It might be something about his own internal development process. It might be around practical opportunities to improve his life circumstances, i.e. I can help you claim the benefits that you're entitled to. I can help you with the process of housing, applying for housing. I can sit down next to you and go through a C100 form around child contact arrangements online where you're not confident in doing that yourself. You have to be offering the dad a carrot, even if the reason you're engaging with him is because he's engaged in terrible behavior up to that point with his family. Why should he engage with you to change that? Particularly if he views you as kind of like someone who's coming in to tell him, reinforce that what he's been told his whole life, that he's wrong, he's not good enough, and his behavior is unacceptable. We still have to tell him that, as Brid said, there has to be high challenge, but no man will accept high challenge if he, he'll just avoid that. He'll go, what do you want to talk to me about? You want to tell me I'm wrong? All right, bye. And I think we have to think more broadly about what can I do in the first instance to bring this man into my service so I can have eyes on him, so I can build a relationship, so I can bring about some high challenge. Because if you haven't got a positive relationship with him, the moment you do that, you may find it yourself, off he goes, or he becomes really spiky and becomes really resistant to that engagement. So we don't just work through one-to-ones, we work in group settings as well. We deliver, as Brid was talking about, a marvelous model called Caring Dads. But we also do stuff before the domestic abuse kind of level. We think it's really important that you do have a kind of a tariff of different interventions that you can offer to men in group settings, starting as early as possible. I saw someone put in the chat somewhere, I think it might be a health visitor or a midwife, that the earlier you engage with men, scientifically kind of this is proven, the more likely they are to stay involved in the life course of their children, regardless of what happens with the relationship with the mother of their children. So if you can start talking to men while they're expecting around the importance of their role, what it means for them and what it means for their children, regardless of what happens in the relationship, they will start to value that import. I can't tell the amount of times that I've come across men who have gone through a difficult relationship, are having problems in kind of negotiating with their ex-partner and around arranging contact, and I've kind of gone, what, it's so difficult, I'm just going to step back for now. And when the child's a little bit older, they can come and look through myself, or I'll step back in then. And I literally sometimes grab guys by the shoulder and say, don't say that to me. That's not good enough. You don't realize, how important establishing a relationship and attachment with your child is now. So even if it takes 6 months or a year, I'm going to support you and work with you to kind of make sure that you don't forget that you're a dad and how important you are to your children. And if there's things you need to change between now and then to allow that relationship to happen, I'm going to do all I can to help you change those things. If it's other people, I'll support you to try and get those things changed. But the role of father is so important, whether absent or playing a role. So men find it really easy sometimes, with all this pain and all this stress and trauma, to just kind of go, what, this is too painful for me. I can't cope. I'm going to distract myself by going out a lot with my mates, or starting a new relationship with a new woman, maybe, and having a new baby over here. And we have to recognize that happens, and isn't just because they're selfish. Maybe a little bit because they're selfish, but it's often because they're struggling to cope with trauma, basically, and with pain. Intensive outreach and engagement is really important. We can't expect men to turn up at our services. Even if we offer them a bacon butty and a coffee on a Saturday morning, it may not be enough. We have to go out, find men where they are, sitting in the spaces where they don't want you to talk to them, where they don't really want you disturbing their peace. In certain parts of London where we work, there are communities of Muslim men that sit down and have coffee shops and cafes, and some places they sit in the summer and have a smoke and a shisha. And I remember doing outreach with a colleague of mine who's a father's worker, approaching those men and saying, we're from this charity and we think the role of fathers is really important. And those men were very dismissive. In our community, we don't work in that way. We don't need any support around being dads. It's different in our community. The women do all this kind of stuff and we don't really do it. And we were prepared for this. So we whipped out a set of laminated photos of Muslim men playing with their young children and infant children, and said, oh, well, from what you're saying to me, this must be a staged photograph then. And I'm sure some of these men are local men that you may know. And they laughed, and said, oh, all right, you've got me. I just didn't want you to be bothering me today. But actually, of course, yeah, we are involved in our day-to-day lives. I change nappies. Sometimes my wife works and I have to cook, or I'm doing the school run. And they opened up about the change dynamics. But if you were not resilient, one of the traits we want to model and hope the men have themselves, if I wasn't able to kind of put up with their initial spikiness and negativity, I would have just taken their word for it and walked off and left them. But we were persistent. And out of that persistence has been built a kind of sense of community capital within certain groups, where we don't even have to now anymore do as much outreach as they did, because word of mouth, men are saying to their brothers, to their friends, to their colleagues when they become dads, there's a local service that's really good and trustworthy. And whilst they work with the local authority, they're kind of separate. So we kind of take away some of that stigma that still exists around, you know, certain services being there to just disrupt your life or take away your children or mess with you, or they're inherently or institutionally racist, which is a reality in some areas. So it gives you an in to start challenging some of their preconceived notions and beliefs, you know, looking at it from their point of view first. But particularly some of the other models that I didn't touch on, actually, I want to say those abbreviations there. SFFC, it's a parenting program from the States, from Chicago, that was developed to particularly work with Black families in America, and it's called Strengthening Families, Strengthening Communities. It's run, the license is held here by a group called the Race Equality Foundation. It's a really, really great program of Triple P is the other one there, and incredible years. We've trained up and delivered all of these models to men in men-only groups, and we found from our experience, Strengthening Families, Strengthening Communities works the best because the underlying, because A, it's kind of has sensitivities to people's history and backgrounds, whatever their ethnicity or whatever their culture is. It's an important part of the delivery of the course, whether it's for men or for women. So it asks them to bring in positives from their childhood, things they want to pass on to their kids, as well as things that they want to leave in the past. So trauma, abuse, overly harsh discipline, often for men, is an issue that they were often parented really, really harshly. And even though they've got a problem with it, you find they repeat those patterns with their own children because sometimes it didn't do me any harm. Well, actually it did. Let's unpack that a little bit, you know, and I think that's some of the really important work we do, and building violence-free communities is at the core of that program as well. So whilst it's not a domestic violence or a domestic abuse intervention program, we know that, you know, the progress or the genesis from being someone who has not been abusive to being an abuser in a relationship can be overnight. One day you're abusive, next day you weren't, but the thought processes behind that don't develop in one day. You're grown up within a system that kind of justifies and allow you as a man to believe that under certain circumstances it's okay to express yourself in that way, or to express that level of control over people. Maybe not by the law, maybe not what social workers say, but within my community, within my social grouping, and within people's opinion that I value, that's what you're supposed to do. So breaking that and disrupting that pattern is really important. It seems simple, but just promoting positive images of fathers. You know, if you run a setting or a space where you want families to come into, and it's for children, it's for families, having some images of men up on the wall doing positive things with their children is a really important thing to think about. You know, we talk about diversity, but diversity of how we represent our families and showing men doing positive things from a strength-based perspective is really important. You know, over the years, we've been asked to kind of work with local authorities to help improve their you know, to try and help them pick up the amount of men who engage with their mainstream services. And we've done mystery shopping with our service users, going in, turning up at local children's centres or family centres, and have said, look, I walked in and at the door everyone viewed me with suspicion, asked me who I was and why I was there, kind of like made me fill in 4 forms and wouldn't let me pass reception into the building because they were worried that I was there to kind of snatch children or something. Even if I turned up with my own child, I was viewed for suspicion. And as I walked around the building, I didn't see one image of a man anywhere. The only reference I saw to men was when I went into the toilet, where there was a poster on the wall about, if you're a victim of domestic abuse, this is what you should do. And he went into one of the kind of disabled unisex toilets. That's why it was in there, not in the men's, I guess. So I think it's really important to kind of battle against that. And there are great resources out there. You know, you can go on the internet and print off and laminate images of dads from multiple backgrounds doing positive things or saying positive things about being a dad. Ordinary dads too, not just celebrity dads, because as young men have said, some of the dads I work have said to me, it's easy for them, they're millionaires, they've got nannies, of course they can be good dads. It's what about me? I've got no money, I'm struggling, I'm still sleeping on the sofa in my mum's house. How can I be a good dad? So seeing ordinary men, local men like them doing something positive is really important, and hearing their stories again is also really, really important. So that peer kind of voice or that peer input into your services is really important if you can make that happen. Next slide, please. And again, please do remind me when I'm getting close to the end of my time, and I'll try and pick up the pace. Thanks. So as I said earlier on, it's really important to promote as early as possible to fathers and men, and to their partners as well, actually, because as we know, women are often gatekeepers to services, because we know they're in receipt of services. When women become pregnant, they've got a midwife, they've got a health visitor, all the services kind of start gearing up and whirring around mum, housing, benefits, everyone's giving her information and advice. So if you want to get to men, often men who don't turn up in these buildings, you often have to give that information to mum, and also promote to mum as well the importance of giving dad the opportunity to be involved in services as well. And often mums go, oh no, he's too busy, he's got work, it's not really for him, oh, he won't be interested, I won't, you know, give her a booklet or something to give to him. Say to her, it is important, and we've got unique services for him, and we've got things that you can come to together as a couple, you know, where you'll both be welcome, and there'll be most of the section of the day for you and a section of the day for him. You know, and I think that's really important because it models as well to both parents that we're inclusive, that we don't only deal with men when there's a problem. Actually, from the outset, we want all men to know that they're valued and they're important in our area, in our locality. You know, and particularly for non-resident dads, as I said earlier on, them knowing that their children, you know, I've not been there, I haven't been able to establish a good relationship. What's the point of me trying? You know, promoting to them how important they're going to be to their children, even if at this moment it seems like all their child cares about is milk and doing poos, is really important to them. You know, we also, as I touched on earlier on, deliver this Caring Dads pilot. When we move higher up the kind of pyramid of need, and we do get into a position where, whether with young parents, unfortunately, because sometimes this is their first serious relationship and they've got masses of complex things going on and lots of pressures from both paternal and maternal grandparents about how they should be living their lives and how disappointed they are that they've ruined their lives by becoming pregnant, it can be really stressful for them. And we all know with the recent update to the domestic abuse bill, that there's been specific guidance for local authorities around how to include men within provision, also about recognising younger parents' relationship, those under 18, that it can be deemed as domestic abuse before it wasn't legally seen as domestic abuse. When you had two young people, 16 or 17, violent within a relationship, it was seen as kind of something different, you know, that it didn't meet the legal threshold or the statutory threshold within services to be seen as domestic abuse. And that was problematic because it means that no resources were allocated to that age range around supporting them around healthy relationships. I do think it's important to make that distinction as well, that as Brid mentioned, there are lots of various, you know, domestic abuse isn't just one size fits all, or it isn't just the 7-8 types of abuse we recognise: financial, emotional, violence, power and control. There are literally young people who are being born and grown up in a violent family themselves, in a violent social grouping. You know, some of these young people who are kind of on the fringes of serious youth violence and gang activity in some of the areas we're working with. Violence is everyday currency for them in how they live their lives. So expecting them, when they form a relationship or when they've done what young people do, which is explore each other's body physically, sometimes children are born from that, to expect them to be having loving, caring, equal relationships is unrealistic. What they need is a lot of support around the basics of how to relate to each other and what your children need, and why violence in this and all situations is unproductive is really important work. Sometimes we really jump to kind of managing the risk because we're really concerned, quite rightly so, about the safety of babies. But what we really need to do is try and wrap those young parents as a couple, and particularly young fathers specifically, because they have different needs to young mums developmentally, as well as in terms of kind of physically and all the rest of it, and in terms of what they're trying to achieve in their lives. We really need to think about what our offer is to those younger parents. I don't know how big a issue it is in Yorkshire, but for us, I mean, we've seen a fall in teenage pregnancy. We've got some good long-acting reproductive control methods now in this country that's seen our TP rates go down, but we're still high. And those people who do become young parents still need that support. It's interesting, during COVID, in some of the areas we worked in, we saw a spike in teenage pregnancy, which the stats haven't come out yet, but almost would make sense, because if young people have been locked up and they've got nowhere to go and nothing positive to do, you know, as you know, what did my nan used to say? Devil makes work for idle hands, something like that. She said, you know, when you've got nothing else to do, nothing positive to do. So multi-agency approaches are really important. As I said earlier on, we're a charity, and we could go out, get funding from a charitable trust or from a donor and go out and say, right, we want to deliver a program in this particular area. Working by ourselves is never going to achieve the goals we need, because it just kind of replicates that isolation and that siloing of men that happens more broadly in services. So a big part of our work when we go out is to make relationships with key agencies, key professionals and key stakeholders and decision makers in the local authorities where we're delivering a service. At the very least, to make them aware that we're there and what we're trying to provide, so that when we turn up as a kind of named preferred support in a team around a child or a team around a family meeting with one of our clients, they aren't surprised as to who we are and why we're there. But in the best case scenario, we're made part of the operational, if not the strategic planning about how we pivot services in that area, and how we can also share our expertise with professionals in those areas by doing a bit of training and doing a bit of kind of consultation and joint working approaches. For example, we've got the Family Nurse Partnership where a lot of our programs are based. We want to sometimes be co-located in children and family centres. We want to go out on joint visits with the Family Nurse Partnership to make sure that when they're meeting young mums for the first time, if dad's there, we can directly engage him, or at least talk to mum about the importance of getting dad included and sharing his information, or asking him for his phone number if it can be shared so we can make contact with him. You know, modelling again that joint approach to work is really important for these parents, because they don't see that. They only ever sometimes see really well-meaning and well-intentioned, but only women, and it reinforces the idea that early years and parenting is all women's work, and we have to change that. So getting more men in your workforce as well, if you can possibly do that, is really important. Doing face-to-face and cold-face work with families is really important. A challenge, I know, a bit like teachers in early years and all the rest of it, and primary education, and in early years education as well, which is where I started many years ago. Kind of when I first became a young dad, I was quite confident and thought, yeah, I quite like looking after my baby. I might be able to look after other people's babies. It didn't hurt that my mum was one of kind of old-fashioned nursery nurse people, so I kind of had it in my blood. But you know, it's a start, and we can get more men doing direct work with children, particularly young children. Really important work. Can I go on to the next slide? I realise I'm getting close to the end of my time. I'm going to just whiz through. So why do we do this work? Next one, please. So we know these are the Florey outcomes that have been published for 20 odd years now, I think. You know, we know that children with positively involved fathers tend to have, and you can pick any one of those bullet points that suit you. I'll pick a couple. Higher educational achievement. We did big surveys with the men. We did a big kind of school gate survey. We was going out and meeting just men who were involved in drop off and pick up of kids, men who are not necessarily subject to our service, but we were just trying to garner the opinion of men in the areas. And the number one thing that men thought what they wanted to impart to their children, they wanted their children to have, was good discipline. Now, discipline in its broadest sense, because again, when men say, oh yeah, kids need to be disciplined, people think, oh, does that mean he's violent? Does he beat his children? What they meant was discipline in its truest kind of dictionary definition, that I want my children to behave in a way that allows them to absorb the messages the teachers are trying to give them. I want them to be able to achieve what they can at school so that they can have better opportunities in life than I had, because I mucked about at school, or where I came from, we didn't have a great education system. I know some people might question that depending on where you live, how good the education system is now. But in global terms, we're still really lucky to have free at point of access education that will see you right through to university before anyone asks you for any money, sort of thing. So it's really valuable to break cycles of intergenerational poverty as well, and that's what men want. And most men, regardless of their background, see education as the key pathway into that. We know that people from minority and immigrant communities as well really value education, which is why we see outcomes for children from those communities a lot higher often than the median, especially during primary school years. And then when the challenges of kind of social issues or maturity or trying to fit into the adult world come in secondary school, we see some of that dip down a bit. But definitely at primary school, you see, you know, that focus on education and that familial input into valuing education really prominent within families. So we should capitalize on that with men, and be clever and design programs around schools, if at all possible, and with schools to include men there, because their kids are there, you know, 5 days a week for most of the day, 5 days a week. So it's a really important site if we can do that. Non-traditional attitudes to earning and childcare, when we're talking about bringing about a more fair and equal society, it's really important. Again, men accepting that actually, look, my wife got much better earning potential than me, a much better job. Again, not wanting to kind of make this all about marginalised men or men from ethnic minority communities, but often, as Brid made the point, black men are often struggle, no matter what they achieve educationally, to get the jobs or to get the career progression that maybe sometimes their partners do, because either they're in mixed relationships, or we know that society accepts black females in some ways in the workplace because it's a white dominated workplace. They're not as threatened as black men further. So we find a lot of men whose partners have much more established careers than they do. They've got insecure work, 0 hours contracts, sometimes they work in shifts, where their partners have got pretty good jobs with a local authority or in a corporate sector. So whether they want to or not, they find themselves, just for the practical realities of their family, having to take on more of the childcare roles. And actually, after a little while, if you can get past any resentment that men are feeling about that and actually show them the positives of that opportunity, it can actually change and model to their children a dynamic that it isn't men are always breadwinners, it isn't mums that always stay at home and do the cooking and the cleaning. These are tasks that should be shared based on your availability and based upon your kind of what you're good at within the family, not based upon the sex or the gender of your parents. And another one that I will kind of just pull out of it really quickly is the more satisfying adult intimate relationships. If we want to break the cycle of unhealthy, unequal relationships, if we want people to make better choices about when they become parents, positively involved fathers for boys and girls are really, really important. You know, I often hear tropes saying that when boys become problematic at school, they need their fathers, they need male role models. We need to challenge this harmful male behavior by sticking them in front of a man who's going to do what? Shout at them and intimidate them into behaving better. No, what we need to do is put models of positive masculinity in front of boys and girls so they can look up to that model and try and fit in with that. And fathers are the primary source of that as early as possible. So if we can promote more of that, we'll be better off. Next slide, please. Yeah. I'll pick a couple of these. We do this work because for many men, it's difficult for them to identify key avenues of support amongst their own families or friends. You know, existing service provision often isn't set up for them in regard to raising children, no matter how welcoming people are. If they say it's a parent group, when you turn up and you're the only one amongst 20 women or 15 women, it can be quite intimidating for a man, even if he comes off as cocksure or confident. You know, it can be quite, you know, difficult to persevere in those spaces. So trying to make, maybe for a while until culture changes, some male only spaces as a pathway or a conduit into broader universal services could be a good idea. Men are often not as prepared for women as for parenthood. They don't, through play in their early years, learn as much. As changing now. Actually, schools, for example, early year settings are being a lot less gender conformist in the way they're doing, the way they distribute toys, for example, or the way that they let children play. It's starting to change, so that's really good. But still, you will find amongst women and men that they treat their children differently. You know, a little boy falls over and skins his knee and people pick him up. Never mind, brush that off quickly. Don't worry, don't cry. A little girl falls over and skins her knee and everyone picks her up and gives her loads of hugs and kisses and say, don't worry, it's all right, baby, I love you. We're enforcing those approaches to boys and girls, and they're learning from those approaches from very, very young. So trying to challenge that and show parents where actually, if you're going to give hugs and kisses to the girl, give hugs and kisses to the boys. If you want the boy to not make a fuss about a minor cut, tell the girl she shouldn't make a fuss about the minor cut as well. We shouldn't do this stuff based on gender. Really important to think about. Of course, we've talked about trying to reduce domestic abuse, but I also think it's really important to think now about kind of men's access to children when things go wrong. In recent years, there's been a massive fall off in legal aid support. You know, the ability for men where there are challenges between mother and father, and where even with professional support, they can't come to agreement. A lot of men, particularly those from lower socioeconomic groups, particularly those without confidence in their ability to write and read, or the ability to engage in really sometimes quite long and complicated online forms, if they're IT poor, if they haven't got Wi-Fi, or if they haven't got credit on their phone to get on the internet, how do they make this application to court? You know, so identifying avenues locally where there might be a lawyers or a family solicitor that offers some pro bono advice to dads, or putting together a pack of information for dads about how they can kind of go through these processes themselves are really important. It can be challenging to do this because sometimes you feel like, well, I'm setting myself up in between a conflict between men and women. And often I hear from social workers, well, family law, that's got nothing to do with us. You've got to go and deal with that. Unless we're pursuing a case ourselves, that's between you and your partner. But actually that can be really debilitating for men, because as we know, the norm is mum has the children unless there's a really specific reason why she can't cope with them, and leaving access to dads who can't actually navigate the legal system. The complex and long-winded justice system is not really fair for the children or the men. Always better to work out an agreement through mediation if you can, but if it comes to the point where that can't be done or it's not safe to do so, at least setting up, you know, some sort of contact for dads, even if it's in a supervised way, is really important to help them with that bonding and with that attachment, so that they see them, so that they're motivated to keep doing work on themselves to be better dads. It's so important. Next slide, please. So And again, on to the next one again. So we've done, research is really important, and Brid kind of is going to send a lot of links out to more, and there's more and more pieces of really good research popping up all over the country around dads, specific groups of dads, the effects of different things on dads, not always around violence. And we did some ourselves, and this wasn't with our most complex cohort of men, but we did this 3-year longitudinal piece of kind of quasi experimental research, and we found that fathers engaged in our service showed a significant shift, a statistically significant shift in their parenting styles during the time that they were engaged with us, and they moved from being either permissive to authoritative, which is really good initial evidence that working with fathers has positive longer term impact, not just on the dad themselves but on their children. And in addition to that, children under 2 years of age whose fathers were more engaged with parenting services were measurably more advanced developmentally than those who were not engaged. So, I say this to dads and I say this to mums when they go, oh, why should I pass his number on? Why should I pass your number or this flyer you've given me or this booklet you've given me for new dads onto my partner? Because he will just moan at me and say, why am I harassing him with this stuff? These people just want to know our business and get involved in our lives. And when you point out to them, look, you and your children will be scientifically proven to be better off. Your kids are going to have a better start in life. They're going to attain better if you're both involved. And why? If you've got something heavy to lift, would you try and lift it yourself when someone's there who's got a vested interest in lifting it with you? Why would you, when I'm trying to sell you to come on a parenting course and go, oh, it's all right, I've got cousins, I've looked after my cousin when they were a baby once in 2019 or something. Listen, if your car breaks down, do you pop the hood and start feeling about with stuff that you've got no idea what it does? No, you don't. You take it to a mechanic or someone who can fix cars. When you have a brand new baby born and you don't really know anything about it, why wouldn't you want to learn a bit more about what they need and how you can meet their needs? It's just kind of putting things to men in terms that they can understand and that they relate to, and it demystifies things and actually go, oh, this is the most commonly heard phrase I've heard from fathers. Oh, I've never really thought about it like that before. If I had £1 for every time men told me that, I'd be on Dragon's Den, giving entrepreneurs money to start new businesses and stuff like that. But unfortunately, charity doesn't work that way. Anyway, next slide, please. So on to some practical stuff that hopefully you'll find useful. And these are messages from the practice tool that Brid talked about, and it's been updated now. I think it should have been ready for the spring, but it'll probably be for the summer. I know Brid's done the hard work and sent it back to RIP. But the reason why I pull these tools out, because we deliver in where we're embedded, and we're embedded in one South London borough where we've been working particularly around domestic abuse, and delivering under the What Works with Children social care strand and the children affected by domestic abuse strand, which is home office money that looks at new ways of working, right? And we've been embedded within social care, working with women's orgs, Athena, IDVAs who work with mums and those people running services like, for example, Escape the Trap, which I have some issues with the name of that, but I understand it, that is run for women and children who are survivors of domestic abuse, and we run Caring Dads for the Men, as well as specialist case holding fathers and running an advice hub for social workers who bring cases. Because if you think about it, in the London Borough, we work in and do this. I think last year they had 400 cases where domestic abuse was a concern, like child protection cases. We can case hold maybe 30 dads a year from that 400 families. So the reality is you can't set up these siloed specialist services to address all of the needs in relation to men. Social workers, early help, family support, they have to do this work and be confident that they're able to do the work. So equipping them with a training day, but also a tool that they can refer to every time they get that feeling, oh God, I've got to go and see that dad again. It's just remind them, just read through these, just think about this stuff, however difficult, spiky, no matter how big an arse he was last time you tried to contact him on the mobile phone, just look at these messages again before you go out and have that interaction. Do your safety planning, of course, make sure you're comfortable engaging with him, maybe set up a contract with him so he knows the behavioural standards you'll accept or won't accept, what will end an intervention. It doesn't mean I won't ever come back to you, but today I'll stop talking to you if you behave like that. And then we'll have to try again next week. And that just makes it longer for you to get what you want at the end of this process. But once you've done all of that, have a look at these tips because they're great. Right. So I'll run through them and just kind of, you can get them in the RIP guide now or the new update one that's coming out in the summer. Be empathetic, really important. I don't want to teach you guys how to suck eggs because you probably do all this stuff anyway. But with men, sometimes it's hard to remember this, particularly when they're being spiky, which is a defense mechanism, by the way. Research shows that. Listen to their perspective. sometimes we run a project with young men, which is a mentoring project, and we called it ventoring, because we realized before the young men we're working with will accept a mentoring relationship, they've got a lot of stuff they've got to get off their chest. It might not be right all the time. It might not be justified. It might be sometimes a bit selfish in their perspective of things, but allowing them to get it off their chest allows the space then for them to listen to you because you've listened to them. A lot of these guys are vulnerable, and as I said, they'll withdraw, or they might even act in a threatening way towards you, you know, as a form of defense, just because they don't want you involved in their lives. Be aware. Brid talked about the power dynamic. A lot of these guys, however physically prominent they are and powerful, they are existing in a world where on the kind of food chain of who's powerful and who makes decisions, they're quite near the bottom of that food chain. And when you come into the lives as a social worker or as a family worker with a certain degree of power over them, of course, if it ended up in some sort of slanging match or a fighting match, they would win. But that's, in most cases, never going to happen. You hold a power over their family and their access to their children, or the dynamic between them and their partner, which is quite scary to men. So bear that in mind when you're going into them. You know, gender relations, your own personal experience, as we touched on and Brid touched on earlier on, might be shaping your experience of him. You know, one of the best CP trainings I ever went on, the trainer made a really important point and kind of put up one of those charts, like, you know, like the Dove pH chart, and it's got alkali at one end and acid at the other. And they said, as a good professional working in families, you should be pH neutral. You have to try to be that regardless of your previous experiences. You can't over-identify and sympathize with a group, and you can't be over-critical at the other end. You can't be too acid and you can't be too alkali. It's our responsibility to try and stay in that neutral space, which can be really hard. I recognize that with some men, depending on their immediate behavior or the histories that you've read before you've gone into that meeting. But you have to try and be egalitarian in that approach. We have to be really aware of shame and how men take that and its role in shaping in their interactions between fathers and workers. You know, there are men who just cannot and will struggle to ever admit their wrongdoing because of shame, or it'll be a long process in getting them to admit that. You know, for men, you can say you're guilty, but to say you're ashamed is something completely different. You know, I'll hold my hands up to that. Yeah, I'm guilty. All right, I did that. But how do you feel about that? You know, and then you'll hear a load of excuses, a load of rationalizations why they did it, but never, it'll take a long time to get to the point when they go, actually, I'm ashamed that I did that. You know, that was wrong of me. It takes a big person to do that, and it can be a journey for those men to get to that place. So let's have patience and let's make sure that we figure in long enough time to do our interventions with men. You know, even for the Caring Dads program, when we ran that program, what we realized was that you can't just get names off a list or just get referrals in. They won't come and attend. What you need is to build relationships and do a lot of legwork beforehand. You know, for 3 months before the first day of the session, be establishing regular relationships with the men that you want to take this program on, particularly those who aren't self-selecting. You know, it's really important you do that. Next slide, please.
I would just say we've got 10 minutes to include some questions as well. So
I think I'm nearly finished, so I'll whiz through. Thank you. Yeah, be knowledgeable. It's really important, as I said earlier on, to know about the law in relation to fathers and parental responsibility, you know, accepting that whatever a man does, he does have certain kind of rights. And more importantly, the children have rights to have a relationship with their paternal family and their dad. You know, regardless of what he may have done, you often find at family court that family lawyers want to protect that relationship because they realize in the long term it's important, even if they order the man to do a certain amount of work before he can have unsupervised contact, for example. But that relationship at some point can be repaired and should be repaired if at all possible. Be safe. Your safety as professionals, you know, often, you know, most of the people I can see on my screen today are women, although you've got your screens off. I'm sure looking at the names on the list of attendees, this sector is very female dominated. So we cannot escape the fact that, you know, some men are dangerous. It is, you know, your ability to work in that empathetic and open way is going to be affected if you don't feel safe and if you don't feel as though you're going into an environment where you're protected. So working with your managers to kind of put things in place so that you're aware when you're working with men who are violent or abusive. We can do that, and we should never do that by kind of placating men who are violent. You know, whilst I say we have to work up to certain high challenge conversations, it doesn't mean we don't acknowledge what they've done. And it doesn't mean that we make excuses for what they've done either. You know, I often hear people saying, yes, he's been horrible to his partner, he's been violent, but he's a great dad. We have to be careful how we weigh that up and how we say that to men, because some men can just hang on to that. Oh yeah, I've done all that horrible stuff, but they said I'm a great dad. And it takes that much longer for them to address the stuff they're doing wrong. Because can you be a great dad if you're being abusive towards your children's mum? Not really, so there's a conversation that we need to think about there. Be consistent and avoid double standards in what you say and how you treat fathers. It's really important that you're consistent in what you say to them and what you say about them. Don't have a conversation with them in person, and then when they read the notes for the next meeting, it's a completely different story that you've written in the notes. You go, but that's not what you said when I met with you. You listened to me and said you understood where I was coming from. And actually now you've written a whole different set of stuff about me when you've gone to the professionals. The dads often complain to us, and in lots of research they've done, that they're always expected or get ostracized when they miss meetings or if they turn up late, even if they've had to get 4 buses to get to the meeting. But if social workers are not available or off sick for a day or is changed and there's an agency member of staff, no one ever apologizes to them. So I think we have to kind of model these equitable relationships. I'll slip onto the last slide for top tips from practice tools. As again, this kind of reinforces that. Go back one if you don't mind. Be reliable, do what you say you will do, be available. If you've given the man a mobile phone number and you say you work these days in between those hours, if you can't answer the phone, please do get back to him. There is an immediacy for some of the guys, particularly those with complex needs and complex backgrounds, where they feel as though, I suppose they're not being petulant, but they really, sometimes things happen to them and they want you to listen. They need someone, they need a shoulder. So we need to make ourselves available. And finally, kind of being honest with both parents about the father's involvement in your practice and in the activities you're doing, why you're involving him, and why, it can be difficult for a mum who's been a victim of male violence or male abuse to understand that you're putting resources into him, but actually are learning from working with family rights groups, for example, who support families who have been through difficult child protection proceedings, is that even mothers who have been through terrible abuse, had their children removed from them because they were unable to protect their children from abusive partners or fathers 20 years ago, now in reflection are going, I just wish there'd been a service like yours available for him at the time. I wouldn't have wanted to stay with him, but he just needed that work. And the fact that he wasn't given any work over these years just kind of prolonged the damage to me and my children. So it's so important, and that's really powerful for me, hearing it from women who have themselves been victims, but still having the empathy to say, I wish someone had worked with him, is really important. The next couple of slides are just the resources that Brid just talked about. There's the practice guidance. The next one is actually about caring dads. You've heard about that. The next one finally is actually just some practical tools that you might want to work directly with dads. There's a group called Music Football Fatherhood. There's a chap called Elliot Ray who founded it after having PTSD after a difficult birth of his daughter. Really important resource which uses music and football to kind of open conversations with men about fatherhood. A really kind of useful and easily accessible for men resource. There's a group called DigiDads who are based in the Northeast Young Dads and Lads Project. Great piece of work that happens, and they set up their young dads as peer educators, and they made a series of films, practical advice for fathers and young fathers. So if you get a chance, go on there and have a look. It might be a great tool to use if you're doing direct work with fathers, or something for dads to go away and look at themselves in their own time. And there's also great reports like this new Pathways for Young Fathers, which is kind of an illustrated workbook for professionals that is a great resource that could actually inform your practice. So if you should get this shared with you afterwards, which I hope you will, click the links. They should work. If not, just copy and paste them, and there'll be some practical stuff there. And my final go-aways before I try and leave a little bit of space for questions is, don't try and do too much by yourself. Accountability, make sure that your systems are changing as well as your individual practice. Make sure you're gathering the data on dads that you need to gather, and that you're actually doing what you say you're going to do. Getting the voice of fathers, service users heard, getting mums' opinions on fathers heard as well is really important, so you can identify blockages and find ways of kind of freeing those up. And again, as I said before, what is your offer to fathers? They'll always be saying to you, why should I get involved? And it's easy to go, well, it's your kids, why wouldn't you? But it's not that simple for men. So let's get a bit more nuanced in our discussion. And I'll leave it there because I've talked right up to the end of my time, and hopefully I can answer any questions that come in.
No, and thanks very much. That's really interesting presentation. It just got me thinking, that analogy in terms of the car and the mechanic, and you've got a child, and actually why wouldn't you get that support? I think that's something that, again, I hadn't thought about, and there's another quid for you. But I think in terms of it's those little things, isn't it? It's actually it's that conversation, it's that being available and persistent. I think as a dad myself, I kind of take that in terms of, I need someone to tell me a few times. I probably don't do something the first time someone asks me to do that, and I'm sure my wife would say the same thing. I think the other bit that I reflect on is the change in the pandemic. So just from dropping off my own kids at school, I'm seeing a lot more dads now dropping the kids off, and I think that's probably the impact of working from home and in a way getting a better work-life balance, being able to take the kids to school, and it's been really good and interesting for me as a dad to be able to have conversations, because I think sometimes you do feel excluded where there's a group of mums on the playground and you're the kind of the token dad dropping your kid off. But actually, I would say that there's that split's kind of, if not reversed, so there's probably more dads now than dropping the kids off and chatting in this playground than there ever has been. So I think, again, with positives and negatives out of the pandemic, but there are just a few things that I kind of took away from your session. I'll come over to Danielle, and then I'll just touch base with Nat to see if we've got any questions from anyone else.
Yeah, it's just it's more of a comment really, because Owen, you touched on families that are involved in private law proceedings. So for those people on the call that don't know about that, that's maybe where there's difficulties and challenges around parents who are not agreeing where a child should live, or where, you know, the contact arrangements. And just in North Yorkshire, we've had quite a lot of quite challenging cases that have been before the court in private law proceedings. And from my perspective, what I've found awfully sad about them, firstly, in speaking to some of the dads because they've maybe complained or what have you, because their lack of legal aid is and not getting into the detail, because there's lots of complexities around all of that, and what's maybe going on within the families is heartbreaking at times. And when you think about it from when I think about it from a perspective of a woman, if that was my situation and my time with my children, and feeling that I had nowhere to go with that, is awfully sad, I have to say. But most importantly, what we to mention around that is that when we see those cases, and we've done a piece of work where we were looking at them and looking at the increase in them, what we see for those children is a lot of them cases then escalate into a child protection arena because of the impact of the challenges within those proceedings. The impact upon those children is really, really significant, and I think that we need to think about what we can do differently at an earlier stage and work with them families to enable them to understand all those perspectives and come up with arrangements that work, because we do see them going into child protection because of the reasons and because of the impact of the proceedings. And it is a real challenge for us, and a challenge on the courts, because they have so many of these things, and some of them go on, you know, they might go on for 2 years. Yeah,
and really tough to keep men engaged and believing that there's going to be a light at the end of that tunnel, you know, especially if they're not having contact during those proceedings. It can be really tough. Obviously, sometimes it's completely justified that they're not having contact. There are substantial enough concerns, but just sometimes because of the backlog in the courts now, because of COVID, how long it takes to get to court, if you turn up and you haven't presented the right evidence, if you're unsupported, sometimes you might not, you know, bring the right information, and you get an adjournment and it's another 3 months or 6 months before a decision is taken about the next time you can have contact. It can be really challenging, and you know, your child might live 3 streets away from you, but you're not allowed to see him. So those problems are things that if we can do more healthy relationships work, more reducing parental conflict work much earlier on, rather than waiting until it's all gone wrong. There should be an acceptance that none of us are born as perfect half of a good relationship. You know, it takes work. It's all about the inputs you've had in you to that point. It's all about some of those characteristics I mentioned right at the beginning. Have you developed those? Have you got the emotional toolkit to cope if, like we know, increasing numbers of relationships don't work, divorce rates are higher than they've ever been, etc., etc. But also we know that actually some groups of society are finding ways of making that work, and we've got an increase in different types of family models, blended families where parents are bringing children from previous relationships together into new relationships. So I think if we can support that, people's choice, and the idea fundamentally at the core of all of this, that children need both parents positively involved, and regardless of the status of the relationship between you two. But that's difficult to do.
Thanks, Owen. Nat, have we got any questions in the chat for Owen?
Well, we've had some really good discussions in the chat around Catterick, which is a large British Army garrison that we have here in North Yorkshire. And there's been some comments around things like baby changing areas being available for men, a new early years foundation qualification in terms of attracting male teachers to work in early years. Mel had a question regarding resources in terms of, is there a booklet already out there to share with families?
There are a few different ones that have been designed by different organisations. I feel like I'm on the BBC and I'm saying there are other shops available, but we do have a few ourselves on our website, resources that we've developed over the years. So if you go to futuremen.org, there's a resources page, so you can look through those if you're interested. But I know, for example, the people I mentioned earlier on, North East Young Lads and Dads, have got resources, both digital and I think some printed resources you can get. Bernardo's have done some good stuff around fathers resources over the years that I hope they've updated and kept available on their websites and stuff like that. And some local authorities have also done some great work. I remember the old DFE, which is Department for Children, Schools and Families prior, did some great kind of photo books, images of young fathers with their children, which I think they republished a couple of years ago, actually. So you might actually be able to get downloadable copies of that as well that you can share, which has got great images that you can print out as a posters and put up in your provision, as well as to give to dads as images of just ordinary men in their homes and out in their communities with their babies, you know, not doing anything amazing, just being there and you know, being present, which is really important.
So I'm going to briefly talk to you regarding some learning from a national report. So I'm going to talk through the myth of the invisible men. I appreciate some of you may have already seen this report. Some, it may be the first time you've heard of it. So I'm going to talk through the learning points from this report, which has been published last September. It focuses on safeguarding children of non-accidental injury caused by male carers, and it was published by the National Safeguarding Children's Practice Review. I can't do the whole report justice in the time that I've got for this, but I've really just kind of picked out some of the key areas of interest, the recommendations that the report highlights, and then provided some local context as to what we're seeing within our reviews that we're undertaking within the partnership, and some of the examples of some of the work that have been ongoing for a couple of years now across our workforce. I have to say this report is quite an easy report to read. I appreciate receiving sort of 60, 70 page reports. It is quite time consuming to read through. So hopefully by myself picking out these kind of themes, you'll be able to understand that. But if you do want to have a read of the report, we'll share the link or just drop the myth of the invisible men into Google, and you'll be able to pull out the slides and the presentation and the document itself, so you can have that to read at your own leisure. But as I say, it is quite an easy read, really, in terms of reports that we're used to. So before I start, I'd just like to really remind people that the content that we'll be exploring is quite challenging and can evoke some strong sort of personal feelings. And I think as professionals, we need to remember that we are human, we're not superhuman. And the day-to-day work that we will be doing, whether you're a social worker, a teacher, a health visitor, a nurse, will have an impact on you as individuals. Sadly, the children that have been reviewed within this report have either sadly died or have life changing or life limiting health conditions as a result of the trauma that they've received. I think it's really important that we look out for ourselves. The analogy of looking out for yourself so that we can help others, I think, really comes to light when we're undertaking reviews ourselves, when we're hearing and seeing and reading, and those of you that work on the front line, when you're actively working with families in this situation. I think it does have a negative impact on us, and we need to make sure that we're receiving the support that we need as professionals and practitioners. So really kind of encourage you to reach out if you're not so doing already to your managers and your services. So since the report in July sort of 18, the panel have established around the 2018 period. It's reviewed a number of deaths or children who've been seriously harmed of around 257 babies under the age of 1 that to non-accidental injury. In just 2020 alone, the panel received 482 notifications from local authorities across the country that related to 515 children. So that's around 35% of these notifications where babies under the age of 1 were involved, and that kind of trend we've seen within North Yorkshire. So we've had 6 rapid reviews relating to children under 1 since the start of the pandemic. And the rapid review is where there's been a child who's died or significantly harmed, where abuse or neglect has been known or suspected. And then sadly, this is a theme that is emerging nationally, regionally. Our colleagues in the Yorkshire and Humber again are seeing that increase in non-accidental injury cases, particularly over sort of the last two years. Prior to that, we were seeing sort of single incidents in previous years. So the review itself focuses on serious incidents in which men are the perpetrator, and as Owen and Brid have said, obviously today we are focusing on men, and there are sadly female perpetrators out there, and we will have heard within the recent news of particular cases. But obviously the attention today that we're focusing on is particularly around men. So the type of abuse is notably is notably the birth father, and we've seen nationally the abusive head trauma, which is I'll come on to talk to you a little bit more about in a short time, but that is one of the areas that we're particularly seeing in terms of where the injury and infliction has occurred. So hopefully you've been able just to read the slide, and we really need to seek greater understanding about the lives of men and see and hear them to understand and undertake the work where we do with fathers. And I think that's a strong message that we've had through from Brid and from Owen this morning, is actually it's understanding men, speaking with men, not necessarily going through mum. I think there's an opportunity for us as practitioners to reach out directly to men and have that direct conversation rather than having a three-way conversation or a conversation that is through someone else. The review looks at how well safeguarding and other services engage with men. Too often we find that services enable men to be absent, and where men are present, services don't really maximise the opportunity to respond to the vulnerabilities. And I think it's really important to say that some men, as some women, will struggle with articulating their fears, anxieties about fatherhood. And we really need to remember that we're there to support. And by doing that, we need to discuss and to talk to them as individuals. The findings review are really far-reaching. They're quite challenging. I think we've been talking about how we engage fathers for a number of years now. And it's something that I know Danielle mentioned. We in North Yorkshire were particularly doing a number of aspects to try and bring it to the attention of practitioners, making sure there's some fantastic work going out there day in, day out across all multi-agency partnership organisations. But I think we feel collectively that there's still more to do. The report itself, I think, is really interesting in the way that it interviewed 8 male perpetrators who are incarcerated in prison for harming their babies. So some real challenging conversations directly with those perpetrators to understand what life is like, what led them to harm their child. So that kind of research by experience in a sad way, but I think that's a really important understanding to speak with those individuals. There was an in-depth field work in terms of the research. a deep dive into 23 of the cases that the national panel had reviewed. And they held meetings with over 300 practitioners as part of the research paper. There was an extensive literature review undertaken and a number of roundtable discussions and one-to-one meetings with key stakeholders. So I'm going to kind of just talk through really the findings that the panel identified. So the review concluded that there was a number of contextual factors linked to non-accidental injury in infants, identified that significant of men who had a background of abuse or neglect, inconsistency in their parenting, so the parenting that they received as a child, they maybe mirror or replicate some of that, and as Owen said, some of that is really positive parenting, and some of that is not so, and how we as practitioners can educate and support those individuals. And I think it's really important to see the theme of mental ill health throughout these cases as well. That was predominantly a feature of mental ill health in the parents that had sadly injured their children. So we talk a lot around ACEs, and I know Brid mentioned around sort of those adverse childhood experiences, and I'm sure every one of us on this call will have had some childhood experience. But particularly with the 8 individuals that are incarcerated, there was a number of adverse childhood, be it bereavement, be it loss, be it abuse, be it that ability to connect, to communicate, were all the features. Substance misuse, especially drug use, was a particular note. So these fathers that have got a substance misuse, I think we see, particularly in the cases where alcohol features, particularly in North Yorkshire and a local area, in terms of how we engage with parents to understand drug use, understand alcohol use, and how we get an accurate picture of someone's alcohol use or drug use. I know if I've been to the doctors and asked them how much I've drank, you probably underestimate your consumption. And I think sometimes we disguise that within the population when people ask us those questions. So it's getting that real true understanding. Domestic abuse, Owen mentioned, is a big feature in the cases that the national panel had identified. And particularly living in pressure of poverty, in debt, worklessness, and I think those are all kind of the vulnerabilities that we are particularly seeing in society today, in terms of the cost of living and that impact it has on families, and where you've got isolated individuals who are not working, who are taking substance misuse or in a domestic abuse relationship. That kind of concoction of all of these different vulnerabilities adds to the vulnerability of a potential injury to a child. And as Owen mentioned around young parents and those care leavers or looked after children, again, the vulnerabilities and areas were identified in those characteristics of those people who were interviewed or feature in those reviews as well. So I'm sure there's nothing new that I've highlighted there, and we can probably take a lot of these examples of vulnerabilities and put them into different contexts of our work in safeguarding, be that through child exploitation, through to modern slavery, domestic abuse. There's a number of these kind of similar vulnerabilities that will allow people to be more susceptible to the different areas of our safeguarding spectrum. So in terms of the key findings, I really wanted just to touch on a few which I found really interesting in terms of the paper. Predominantly male babies were affected. So the children who had non-accidental injury primarily were male babies, boys under the age of 1. The majority were for white British families. And just under half of the incidents identified non-accidental injury occurred around the 3-month period. And some of you who are on the call may be familiar with ICON, and I'll touch on ICON shortly, but it's a really important kind of timescale within the child's life, that 2-month, 3-month period of infant crying. So the peak for normal infant crying, as you can see on the slide, peaks around that sort of 2 to 3 month period. So that is a particular area of time, of information that we need to pass on to parents. And as I say, I'll discuss a little bit more about the work of ICON shortly. The research also highlighted that over half of the cases known were to universal services. Only a few were subject to child protection plans. So again, making sure that we are working at the earliest opportunity and creating an opportunity where we've got an intervention to get those particular messages around a safe sleep, around infant crying, and really an opportunity to engage with dads at the earliest stage. Again, the characteristics which we've covered previously around parental ill health, young carers, young parents, fathers who've got criminal convictions are all those individuals who are more prominent to abusive head trauma. We historically used to call it shaken baby. So there's those factors that we need to be aware of. The report highlights and criticises the role of maternity and health visiting services, and I appreciate we've got some colleagues on the call today, and I know through reviews and audit work that we've done that there's some fantastic work going out across areas. The report itself highlights that there's evidence that universal services such as midwifery and health visiting services in the periods before and immediate after the birth don't regularly or significantly involve fathers. Then this appears to be a pattern of practice that we see as we move into those kind of more targeted and specialist services. And as Danielle alluded to earlier, into that family court space. So that's a particular area that the report highlights as that earliest opportunity to engage with dads. And I think Owen mentioned around being a dad is one of those elements of change for an individual. So if we can work with them and engage them, then we can hopefully change some or upskill some knowledge within their parenting. And that analogy really rings true in terms of if you've got a car, I wouldn't necessarily fiddle under the bonnet with it because I wouldn't have a clue. But actually, if I'm presented with a new baby, I might not necessarily have the skills or the knowledge to undertake that myself. So actually, why wouldn't I reach out to people who have got that experience and make sure that I've got the best opportunities for my child? And then you'll be no surprise really, there was a big emphasis on the challenges around information sharing and making sure that individuals have got access to risk factors, to information about fathers and men as well. I think we're very much focused on sharing information around mums and female carers, and generally the records of children are held within the parent, so generally the mum, where I know we're speaking with health colleagues, again dad's records are sometimes separate and are not necessarily linked, so you don't get that holistic picture. One of the key things and one of the key quotes within the report that really struck me when I was reading it was that you're the first person to ever want to know what actually happened, what I went through. No one ever has asked me before. No one has ever bothered with me. You're the first person that has ever sat down and asked me what my story is. And that was from one of the individuals who are incarcerated. And I think if that's the only opportunity that someone has sat down and spoke with dad to understand, then actually we've missed some opportunities to engage and to educate those individuals. I think that's just a real powerful, actually it's too late when they're incarcerated. We need to be doing that kind of early help with families. So the highlights really from the recommendations of this report, the report identifies 3 areas that they feel will assist this area of work across the country. They believe that more research into male perpetrators of abuse against babies is needed. They feel that this should be commissioned by the government to enable a better understanding of the psychology and behaviour patterns of men who abuse babies through non-accidental injury. They feel that the provision within children's social care needs to improve, and they are pushing the government to fund and enable local areas to develop models of good practice in working with fathers. And we'll come on to hear from Sarah some of the examples of work that is happening here in North Yorkshire. And investment in local pilots. So the pilot, they'd like to see an end-to-end multi-agency integrated service redesign to address the issues and identified from that postnatal period all the way through to those transition periods through education into secondary into higher education and so on. But also those kind of interactions between those transition points from children's services into adult services as well. And just as this report we've seen with the Domestic Abuse Act, there's lots of learning, lots of new ways of working that we can pull up from that as well. I've added some links and I'll put the links into the slides, but just really kind of when looking around this subject area, I think there is a lot of information and research, particularly around working with men. It is a very topical issue for us here in North Yorkshire, but I know from speaking with colleagues across the country, there's lots of work and focus going into this area. So some of you will have heard the 1001 days or read the report from the Ledson review. We've got the development of family hubs, and I know our early help colleagues are exploring what that might look like for us in North Yorkshire, along with multi-agency partners as a government directive for establishing family hubs. There's a support in families, which I'm sure some of you will have been involved with previously, and the Beyond programme in terms of the next stages of that. Those that are in the health economy and health services, you'll be aware that there's the Better Births, which is around modernisation of midwifery services, and as I've already said, kind of looking at the domestic abuse legislation and is there areas that we can improve on. So now I really want to just touch on a few examples of some of the work that we've been doing, particularly as in a result of the non-accidental injury and how we can try and reduce the number of incidents that are happening across North Yorkshire. The frontline practitioners can do some fantastic work across our communities, but I think it's really needed, and I think Brid said this at the beginning, is that there needs to be that systemic opportunity and I suppose for our leaders to set out the necessary conditions where we can enable us to work with men and women and the family as a whole unit, and not necessarily primarily. I know when I was doing youth work sort of 15 years ago, it was very much you would work with a child, and we moved then to working with families and engaging primarily. I think I engaged mainly with a female carer, and very rarely spoke with dad or that significant male carer. So as things change, we need to be able to be given the time and the energy and the enthusiasm and the training to ensure that we can enable the kind of the work to continue. COVID has sadly had an impact upon our lives, and for positives and for negatives. And I think particularly around the antenatal and postnatal services, the opportunity not to see parents face to face during those lockdown days have had an impact on those families. I think it's great to see now that we're back to kind of pre-pandemic services. So those services going out into the households, and I appreciate that there was many face-to-face contacts during those lockdown periods. But I think from the reviews that we've undertaken and from looking through this report, there have been some areas of opportunities that we could have engaged with or potentially missed. with some of our families, and some of our families will have never have experienced the services that we would have as parents maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago, just because of the nature of living in that pandemic period. So what can we do as practitioners? What is our quick wins, I suppose, in terms of addressing this area? I think it's really important that we discuss around normal infant crying. So as I say, the icon, which is the middle logo, hopefully you'll all be familiar with that. But if you're not, I'd encourage you to have a look on our website, or if you Google icon, it takes you to a national website. It's really important that this information isn't just given to mum. And I think that's an opportunity through our health colleagues, but also those that engage with parents to give those consistent messages. So we need to make sure that both parents are informed, are educated, and have got that knowledge to support the growing of their child. So just to say that ICON stands for infant crying is normal. The C is comforting methods can help. The O is it's okay to walk away. And the N is for never shake a baby. And they're the 4 steps, really. We are encouraging people to say that actually babies cry. And we know scientifically that is at peak within that sort of 2 to 3 month period. And it will get difficult. I know from my own experience of having 2 babies that it's tiring, it's hard, it's draining. And there are opportunities where you think, actually, I'm just going to put this baby down and I just need to walk away so I can calm down, so that I can be the best parent that I can be at that particular time. So again, it's reiterating and sharing those messages. And most importantly, if you feel agitated or aggressive, actually just put that baby down and walk away and have a conversation with someone if you can. Calm yourself, and then pick it up again, as long as it's a safe environment to do that. I think we need to talk to fathers and male carers about their experiences of parenting. I'm sure there's many of us who are parents or work with parents that will say, oh, well, my mum said when I was young, this is how they did it. We need to be mindful that actually practice changes, and we need to be able to make sure that we are imparting up-to-date knowledge. I think it's really important as well is that where we have immediate referrals for any babies where there's possible indicators of physical abuse, particularly when babies are non-independently mobile. And we've developed some managing injuries to non-independent mobile children with our health colleagues, and looking at bruising, and there's a practice guidance that's available for practitioners to refer to. And then within our child death overview panel process, in 2020, we identified that as a partnership, we were seeing a significant number of children sadly die by unsafe sleeping practices. So we've been doing a piece of work over the last probably about 12 months now around the day or night sleep right. And again, this is about empowering parents to know what the safe sleep arrangements are for children, and ensuring that this information isn't just the responsibility of the health visitor or midwife, but actually as a multi-agency partnership and partners, we take responsibility to do that at any opportunity, be it as an IRO in a child protection arena in their meetings, be it as an early years practitioner, a police officer, any opportunity really to upskill and to share how we can have safe sleep arrangements.
Jane, just to note, you've got about 4 minutes left.
Okay, thanks, Nat. So we've developed the Safe Sleep campaign, and there is information on our website, and there is literature, materials, training that's available as well. And really it's about getting that message to dad as well as to mum. And I think that's a really important area where we've seen within the reviews where an incident may have occurred, where dad's taken baby downstairs and has had sort of out of routine, so they're not in a Moses basket, not in a cot, they might be on a settee or in a bouncer, sadly, those unsafe sleeping arrangements have resulted in children sadly dying. So again, we need to make sure that we're pushing those messages out. So prior to the report being published, as Danielle mentioned earlier, we've got as a partnership a work stream now to focus on working with dads. This event is one of those kind of actions that come out of that particular group. And later on, we'll talk about hearing from you as individuals as to kind of what is happening on the ground, what are you doing in practice, any good examples, an opportunity to share those with the rest of the people on your breakout call. And I just really like, I don't expect any answers really, but just to get you thinking about kind of some of the questions to ask ourselves. Do we involve men in assessments? Do we involve them in the visits that we undertake, be that if we're a health visitor, a social worker, as a teachers? Do we engage with dads as much as mums? Do letters that go out, are they addressed to mum? Are we excluding dad by not putting him on the letter? If a child's sick, I think generally speaking, it's mum that would get the call. Actually, have we got the contact numbers for dads as well? Do we seek feedback from both parents whenever we're asking for views and opinions? And do we use an inclusive language? And this really got me thinking as a personal experience of mine as a father of 2 children who are sort of under the age of 10. It kind of reflected on, I think, excluded from attending groups when my children were young, and now I suppose it could be classed as an engaged and willing dad who wants to kind of get involved. But I felt that some of the groups themselves, in terms of how they're titled, put me off going. So I can always remember a health visitor leaflet being around, and it's that mother and baby groups. Well, actually, I'm not a mother. Why can't we start using language like parents groups? And I think Owen mentioned in terms of how he's expecting his fathers and boys to get engaged in the programs, is actually, would you do that if you were a father or a boy in that situation? And actually, what am I as a parent going to get out of it? I think we need to be really careful about how we use our language to make sure that we are using it in an inclusive way. So by parent, just changing it from a parent and baby group, actually that's inclusive of carers, of parents, of men and women, and not necessarily just that kind of female dominated play group that we might see historically. And then finally, really, I'd just like to finish with an opportunity and a bit of a plug for our Safeguarding Partnership website. We will put all of the links and information that you've received today on the website. We've recorded this session again, so this is a legacy that we'll be able to use and you'll be able to share with people who haven't been able to participate in today's conference. We've also got a number of social media channels, and again, we'd really encourage you to give us a like or a follow on any of those platforms. Sign up to our e-bulletin so you're getting that information about training, around new practice guidance and other areas. So that kind of brings me to the end of my presentation. As I say, it's been a whistle-stop tour of the actual report itself. We will share the links for the reports, but I'm happy to take any questions. I don't know, Nat, if there's any comments within the chat before we move over to Sarah.
No, we've got no questions as such, but again, there's some great discussion going on between between the delegates and health colleagues on the call.
Fabulous. So I'm going to stop sharing now and allow Sarah to take the virtual floor. So I'll pass over to you, Sarah.
Hopefully everybody can see that. Obviously,
yep,
I can't see you now, so as usual. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Atkins. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the practice supervisor in the Stronger Foundations team, and I am also the lead for parental conflict and stronger relationships. So I'm just going to talk to you today a little bit about the one programme that I've been designing and running for dads. In fact, we're not just doing it with dads, we do it with mums as well, because it's our response to the parental conflict program. So basically we designed, when I say we, I mean Simon Saxton and myself designed this program to work with individuals who were experiencing lots of high conflict within their relationship. So the aims of the program, as you can see here, were to support individuals who demonstrate high conflict, low risk domestic abuse. So when we say low risk domestic abuse, we are working with individuals who aren't working with IDAS, who aren't actually working with Foundation, and aren't going to MARAC. So basically that high conflict that's having a detrimental impact on their relationship, but there isn't any high risk in the domestic abuse aspect of it. So when they've recognised this as a problem and then wanting to explore resolutions and to work through the issues, we want to work with these individuals to definitely to reduce the risk of children's exposure to frequent, intense, harmful conflict. Those of you who've done the training know how much that I keep saying and keep stressing. It's about the impact that frequent, intense, harmful conflict has on children. We're also supporting individuals who use that high conflict, low risk abuse against their partners, but also recognise that they want to change their behaviour. They want to engage in healthy relationships, and they need us to help them to either stay together, or if separated or divorced, stay connected with their ex-partner, because they understand the impact that continuous relationship breakdown has on their children. And we're supporting individuals who demonstrate high conflict, low risk domestic abuse to break that cycle, improve communication, and use some of that emotional management that we do, and develop coping skills and strategies for their anger, which then helps to prevent that overall escalation. And we're working with individuals to understand the damaging and negative impact their behaviour has on their partner and their children. So when we sort of set up this program, we initially thought that we would do it as couples, or we would try and get maybe, males and females to sit on the program and to work through the program together. The program is virtual, which we felt was probably more helpful, because then lots of people from right across North Yorkshire could come and engage and participate in it. However, after the first program, we did get asked by a group of females who've been participants on the program to just do it as individual groups, so one group with males, one group with females, because mainly of their own experiences that they'd had previously in relationships, and didn't feel like they could actually talk about some of those experiences if there were males on the program as well. So it wasn't necessarily started as a dad's program and a mum's program, but that's what it's ended up becoming now. And I think that's worked much, much easier. So I'll just go through the sessions. So session 1, we sort of look at understanding our own connections, those family patterns, golden threads that run through families when we're working with them. And we tend to sort of start looking about the word respect and what does that mean. We start to explore what's a healthy relationship, what does it look like, what does it feel like, sound like, and how do we learn about how to behave in a relationship. Because if we start to discuss about how some of these dads have come through their own relationships previously, but also what have the relationships been like within their own families? What are the traits that they've picked up that they've actually brought into their adult relationships now, which is always very interesting to discuss. We tend to sort of think around as well about, in session 2, we start to look at, well, what happens when that maybe the glue that's holding that relationship together starts to come apart, and why do we think that sometimes those healthy relationships turn into unhealthy relationships? We look at domestic abuse, we look at power and control, and we start then to think about how, if we're in a parental conflict situation, that could escalate into domestic abuse if we're not careful. Session 3, that wonderful 4-letter word love, which I know in North Yorkshire we're doing so much around, but what does this really mean if you're in a relationship? Let's not get really funny about using the word love or intimacy. What does that really mean for a couple if you're in a relationship with somebody? So we think about our love questions, we think about the infamous love tank that I know most of you know that I absolutely love, and we look at our bridge of hope and what hopes have we got for the future within this relationship. We look at the impact of conflict on ourselves, on our loved ones and our children by taking that whole family approach. And we then look at the cycle of conflict, the most important aspect of how we can try and break this cycle, and the cycle of anger and how that continues if we don't actually address some of the issues and the breakdown in the communication. And then our final session, so as you can see, it's only 6 weeks, 2 hours long. Let's think twice. So let's look at our conflict resolution and alternative strategies that we can use. These are some of the feedbacks that we've got from the dads that when we did the dads program, which I thought was quite interesting and gave me quite a lot of perspective really about what we were doing. So the top one especially saying, I didn't know I was being controlling. I thought I was helping her by telling her what to do. And that came about from really exploring some of those dynamics within a relationship and how sometimes that can escalate into an abusive relationship, or it's starting to be controlling a coercive behaviour. So being on the courses allowed me to start addressing some of these issues, because honestly before I just didn't know how to. It's definitely been worthwhile attending the course. It's made me look at myself, my anger issues and frustration in my relationship with my son. So not just the relationship with a partner, but also the relationship with their children. And it's helped control their own behaviour, reactions and attitudes towards things. So as you can see, that this was just some of the feedback. It's a very new programme. We've only had 6 dads on it at the moment, but I thought it was quite insightful. So just going back to our 2 speakers this morning about what's worked well. And these are the things that Simon and I have felt have worked really well in this particular programme, but particularly with dads. So it's that important bit at the very beginning about the referrals and the discussions with practitioners about what some of the issues for dad are really, what they're going through. When we talk about building relationships, I don't necessarily have a lot of time to build relationship up with the dad before we actually start the programme, but I always do a telephone call to introduce myself and to explain the programme and to think about, is that what you really need? Do you want to look at this as a programme to help you to change, but also to start to think about the breakdown within the communication between you and your partner? I like to use curiosity to find out as much information about dad's needs and challenges that he's facing. And it's a great opportunity to provide the space for dads to tell us their story, but without that collusion. So if there has been really high conflict or low domestic abuse, we're not actually colluding with dad. We're understanding his perspective and where he's coming from. It's an evening programme. So obviously that's a lot better for dads to be able to participate in it. And it's also a very strengths-based programme. So recognise the qualities or the strengths that dad has to do to make that change, and listening out for him when we're talking to him to notice things he's saying that are going to help him to make those changes more sustainable. In this programme, we give dads the opportunity to focus on themselves. So we're not necessarily looking at their parenting, or we're not necessarily looking at the partnership. We're looking at themselves as a person. And we make it very clear that we cannot change what their partner's doing, but we can help them change some of the behaviour that they're focusing on their partner. And we can encourage them to keep the child at the centre of their thinking. We make it clear that we're impartial. And very importantly, we think about each dad's learning styles. And if we need to, we have to try and adapt the programme. So, for example, if we've got a dad that's dyslexic and it's a virtual programme, we've got to think about how he can see the slides and how he can actually interpret the information. We also create that secure base from which they can explore what's happening to them. So obviously confidentiality is very important, and we explain that. But I think over the period of the weeks that we start, they get to feel really secure to talk to us about what's happening, even though it is virtual and we're not in the room actually with them physically. They can tell us how they're feeling, or if they've been given a strategy that they can try, they've come back and felt very secure to be able to tell us even if it hasn't worked. It's a combination of restorative, motivational interviewing and CBT approaches, even though it's only 6 weeks. And we deliver the service where the structure, the content, the format and language are appropriate to fathers as participants. We're looking at it from a family relationship perspective, so we tend to get them to address some of the key issues and factors that are going on for them within that whole family unit. We think about inclusivity and making sure that they can access everything that we're doing, but also we sort of think about some of those key risk factors as well, but also some of those sort of influences that are having on their lives. So sort of thinking about their culture, their language, their religion, age, gender, etc., in order for them to fully participate in the programme. And then we start each session with an easy icebreaker, which sometimes they're not very keen on, but then it does break the ice, and we sort of think about some of the questions that we can ask them. So for example, one of the questions is always something around, tell us something that's made you smile this week, or give us a positive reaction to something that you've had going on for you this week. We don't tend to look at sort of some of the issues and the negativity that's happened. We try and get them to focus on the positive, and we try and add humour into the conversation, as well as being able to gently challenge. So I'm just going to sort of try now, if I've got to come out of one bit and go on to another, because we did ask one of our dads to come back and feedback on the course to this programme that we're doing today and to the conference. But unfortunately, although he was quite willing to do it to begin with, I think, he lost a little bit of confidence. And so he's been interviewed by Maggie Mitchell after the course had finished, and basically he was quite happy for the audio to be used, but not so happy for the for him to be his face to be seen. So I'm just going to sort of.
No, it looks like we've got a bit of an issue. So just
come back. I've come back.
Oh,
Would you believe, as typical, as only it could do, it all just failed miserably. So I've managed to get back in. The computer just failed. So hopefully we'll be able to get back into it now. If I can just get into what we need to. Here we go. So hopefully you'll be able to hear what this dad's got to say. Now, Dad A, he has a history of alcohol dependency, and he's been separated from his partner, but he really wanted to do this programme to try and change his behaviour. So I'm hoping if you can just put your microphones on as loud as not your mic, sorry, your speakers on, so that you can hear it. But I'm pretty sure, and there are some flashing images, just to be warned, so hopefully you can all hear.
So there's just a few other bits that I want to ask you that I suppose for us, that's around us working with males really, and working with dads, and thinking about, in terms of that, what you think that when we were doing the programme, what did we do well? What did Sarah and Simon do well, sort of thing? How they approached it, or anything that?
I think the structure was really good. Also, when you've done session 1 and you start session 2 the week after, you go over session 1, which is good. So, because I can forget session 1 by the time I'm on session 2. So I think it's good as well that we got the PDFs or whatever the original after we finished.
Yeah.
And it was set out, and then it was kind of repeated.
But they did like a recap of just.
A recap. Plus, it was that kind of, not paraphrase because it wasn't me who was saying it, but put it in different ways so I can, they said more than once, so I can understand it differently. Yeah, that's quite good actually, isn't it? That sometimes we, if you keep repeating it the same way, if you haven't quite understood it the first time, you're not going to understand it if it keeps being said in the same way. So it's useful for it to be said slightly differently, isn't it, to try and understand. Simon sometimes says it kind of slightly different than Sarah.
Yeah.
Sarah might say it's slightly different to Simon, and like one of them most of the time, it's a penny drop with it.
Yeah, it'll stick. Yeah, that's great.
Also, it wasn't rushed over. I think we took an extra session, to finish off.
Yeah.
We didn't get, because there was a guy on who did talk a lot.
Yeah.
And I think because of that, we had to take an extra session to cover what we hadn't covered.
Right,
so it wasn't rushed through, just to get to the end of it.
In terms of, you've obviously worked previously with early help or children's social care or somebody. So what was the difference between how they worked and how we were working with you?
Again, because it wasn't rushed, and we had diagrams and pictures, because I'm not the brightest person. And
just how it was explained was brilliant, plus the videos as well. You know, so you had a lot of, yeah, I was hearing stuff, I was being able to look at stuff as well. And then having somebody else's point of view, plus the other people what was in the course, we had like discussions about it. So I was able to relate to people as well as learn.
So using all that helped you to connect it all together.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
if it was just told to me like we are talking now, but I have, like I say, I found it hard to, I'm autistic as well, I found it hard to retain some information.
Yeah.
But I had pictures and slides, videos, other people's opinions, and like it all kind of fitted together really well.
Yeah, yeah. And I would say it's more that you've got a different learning style. Everybody learns things differently, and you just learn things differently rather than, I don't think it's to do with being bright or not bright. I think it's how people learn, don't they? We all learn differently, and you know, and maybe you're much more of that pictorial person.
Because I think everybody should go in this, because not even just the people who's in conflicted relationships, just everybody should know how children are affected every day, even when we're in bed and even though Luke is asleep, they're still hearing stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's important. I think if the more people do it and the less children are affected from a young age, the less problems there's going to be later in life, and then it kind of breaks the change, you know, of what's repeated over generations.
So it's almost like what you're saying is that we need much more training in, or whatever you want to call it, in relationships in general, so that people understand the impact, you know, on children. Before, even if they're in any conflict, we need to be making sure that people are aware that if it starts, or if there is, that's the impact it's going to have.
Yeah, then well, I don't think there's anything else you can do, but I think if more people did the course, and more people wanted to do stuff like this, then there'll be less problems from the children growing up.
Yeah, yeah.
Like generation cycles, like the mum and got off what my nan and granddad did, and she's repeated some things, and then she's done her best with me, but there's still been conflict in that. Where with this course, I've been able to break a few cycles, and it's not going to my youngest.
She's really positive, isn't it? Because when you think about your daughter growing up and being in a relationship, then that'll break it a little bit more, and it'll just keep. It's really positive. Anything that you think that we shouldn't do? Is there anything that we did that we think, or even when you've been worked, you know, when you were working with early help or children's social care, is there things that we do that we shouldn't do you think?
Well, I can't think of anything, because there was points in the course where I was getting a little impatient with. I could feel myself getting impatient inside with how much somebody else was talking, but it was how he was understanding, and Sarah and Simon giving the time, you know, so he could understand. Plus, Sarah brought it up, you know, that I think he was getting outside the course as well, you know, bringing stuff up what the course couldn't fix, and Sarah kept reinforcing that. You can only fix yourself, and you can't fix everybody else's problem. He was using like he was saying, like he was using the you word a lot, like instead of like I feel, because and Sarah could feel when he was talking the stress and anxiety in his voice, and she can manage to shut it down a few times, you know, before, which is not, I don't mean badly shut it down, like.
So basically, we're running out of time, so I'm not going to be able to finish the whole of the recording, but that just gives you a little bit of an insight into what one of our dads was saying about the course. And I think it sort of highlights as well about the fact that we have to think about that this dad especially was telling us about, you know, about using a whole range of different resources. So it's not just about being able to pick up all of the strategies to use by just sitting and talking to him. We've got to think about some of the imagery that we use, some of the visual resources, and also some of the practical exercises that we can do with him. So that was just a little bit of a taste from one of our dads about the kind of feedback that he wanted to give about being on the course. It's not to sell the course, because we're still getting quite a few people that are interested in being on it. So and as we try and keep the course just to be sort of 4 to 6 people, it's very important for the dads that have been on it. They've all said that they like it because there's only a few people, so they don't feel intimidated by being on it. Okay, so thank you. That was it. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Sarah. We've got a couple of questions I'd just like to pick up, if I may.
Yeah.
So one of the questions is just around, is there any plans to involve dads in the delivery of future sessions to other dads?
Yes. So at the end of each of the 6-week programme, when we send our feedback, we always say, would you like to help to co-facilitate the course? And we've had 4 dads that have come back to say, yes, they would really like to do that. So my next task is to write a Train the Trainer course and to get them on it so that we can start to get them to help us to deliver it to other dads. And I think for that young man that we were just talking to with Dad A, when we first started, he wouldn't even put his camera on. And yeah, you know, he did say he would come on to the conference and talk to everybody, but I think obviously his confidence just waned. But at least he came and he did that recording. He was quite happy for everybody to hear what he had to say about the programme. And he's one of the people that would really like now to deliver it with us. So it's great.
No, that's great news. And I think just listening to the voice of the dad, I think is really powerful, actually, even just not seeing his image. And then the next question was just really around just I suppose a curiousness of the dads that have been on the programme. Have they maintained sort of the relationships outside of the sessions, and is this sort of something that's I suppose a sustainable model of support and that support network going forward?
And I think that's what Maggie was trying to get at when she was talking to him about, is there something that you would like at the end of it? Is there somebody that could help you? So maybe that's a children and families worker or social worker at the end, just to reiterate and go over some of the tools that we've used. But I've spoken to all 4 of the dads that wanted to co-facilitate, have all said it has made a difference, especially when Dad A was talking there about using the U word all the time. It's something that resonated a lot with him when he was saying that's what he was always doing to his partner, using the you word towards her and not using the I feel and I understand and so on and so forth. So yeah, I think it is, I mean, obviously it's a very new programme, so we haven't got a longitudinal sort of research done on it yet, but I think by going back to dads, I mean, obviously I'm still in touch with them because they're going to be doing the Train the Trainer programme, but I think we can use practitioners to think about what's been done, at the content of what's been done within the sessions, for them to go back over with dads when they've actually done the course, so they can just go back and say, do you remember when you did that really helped you with that coping strategy? Let's go back and have a look at it again. And we always send out the PowerPoints, so that's what Dad was saying, that he goes back over things because he can't retain all the information because it's a 2-hour session.
Yeah, no, that's great. And we've got some a comment there just in terms of some really positive feedback as a result from mums and dads who've attended that course. So that's great. Thank you very much, Sarah. We're going to, if anyone does have any questions, please feel free to drop them into the chat. I'd just like to hand over to Dan.
Okay, thanks everybody. It's been a very interesting session, but I won't hold you up more than 5 minutes now. So just reflections for the day, really. Starting with Brid Featherstone and us moving forward, really considering what she describes of the intersectionality of the work, poverty, mental health, unemployment, childhood trauma, and having a looked after history and the impact of all this on our work with men, really, and doing that more holistic work with people, having the questions, being curious, and doing all those things when we're engaging with people right at the beginning of their work with us, so we get beyond the single story, really. Thinking about Owen and thinking about some of the 7 characteristics, really: resilience, inclusiveness, which I think we've talked about a lot today, and including men and non-resident parents, reflectiveness, resourcefulness, curiosity, compassion, empathy, and non-violence. And the takeaway piece with him, really, it's not about not challenging violence, but it is about, you know, high challenge coupled with high support, and doing those things and doing them both and doing them well. Thanks to James, some reflections from the national report, really. And, you know, my takeaway from that is for us to consider more what fathering means to the men that we are working with, but also to the children and to the family unit and what that looks like, and about the value and valuing people, so we are inclusive, and staying connected. Thanks, Sarah. But very interesting. That course sounds like it's been a real success, and the future of getting men delivering on that who've done that, I think, is really positive. I think what that highlights is the importance of us asking the men that we work with what works for them, what doesn't work for them, and what we need to improve on, because ultimately that is the most powerful feedback that we receive on a day-to-day basis. So just reflecting on 3 points from Owen, really, to end for today: be reliable, be available, and be honest. And I think if we stick to those 3 things, we probably can't go far wrong. So wishing you all the best for the rest of the week. Hopefully you can nip off and get some nosh now, because if you're like me, you're probably starving, and then enjoy the afternoon. Thank you for coming. It's good to